Part 2. From now on, it can be said that plague was the concern of all of us. Hitherto, surprised as he may have been by the strange things happening around him, each individual citizen had gone about his business as usual, so far as this was possible. And no doubt he would have continued doing so. But once the town gates were shut, every one of us realized that all, the narrator included, were, so to speak, in the same boat, and each would have to adapt himself to the new conditions of life. Thus, for example, a feeling normally as individual as the ache of separations from those one loves, suddenly became a feeling in which all shared alike, and together with fear, the greatest affliction of the long period of exile that lay ahead. One of the most striking consequences of the closing of the gates was, in fact, this sudden deprivation befalling people who were completely unprepared for it. Mothers and children, lovers, husbands and wives, who had a few days previously had taken it for granted that their parting would be a short one, who had kissed one another goodbye on the platform and exchanged a few trivial remarks. Sure as they were of seeing one another again after a few days, or at most a few weeks, duped by our blind human faith in the near future, and little if at all derived from their normal interests by this leave-taking. All these people found themselves, without the least warning, hopelessly cut off, prevented from seeing one another again, or even communicating with one another. For actually, the closing of the gates took place some hours before the official order was made known to the public, and naturally enough, it was impossible to take individual cases of hardship into account. It might indeed be said that the first effect of this brutal visitation was to compel our townspeople to act as if they had no feelings as individuals. During the first part of the day, on which the prohibition to leave the town came into force, the prefect's office was besieged by a crowd of applicants advocating pleas of equal cogency, but equally impossible to take into consideration. Indeed, it needed several days for us to realize that we were completely cornered, that words like special arrangements, favor, and priority had lost all effective meaning. Even the small satisfaction of writing letters was denied us. It came to this. Not only had the town ceased to be in touch with the rest of the world by normal means of communication, but also, according to his second notification, all correspondence was forbidden, to obviate the risk of letters carrying infection outside the town. In the early days, a favored few managed to persuade the sentries at the gates to allow them to get messages through to the outside world. But that was only at the beginning of the epidemic, when the sentries found it natural to obey their feelings of humanity. Later on, when these same sentries had had the gravity of the situation drummed into them, they flatly refused to take responsibilities whose possible after-effects they could not foresee. At first, telephone calls to other towns were allowed, but this led to such crowding of the telephone booths and delays on the lines for some days that they were prohibited, and thereafter limited to what we called urgent cases, such as deaths, marriages, and births. So we had to fall back on telegrams. People linked together by friendship, affection, or physical love found themselves reduced to hunting for tokens of their past communication within the compass of a 10-word telegram. And since, in practice, the phrases one can use in a telegram are quickly exhausted, long lives passed side by side, or passionate yearnings, soon decline to the exchange of such trite formulas as, "Am well, always thinking of you, love." Some few of us, however, persisted in writing letters and gave much time to hatching plans for corresponding with the outside world. But almost always these plans came to nothing. Even on the rare occasion when they succeeded, we could not know this, since we received no answer. For weeks on end, we were reduced to starting the same letter over and over again, recopying the same scraps of news and the same personal appeals, with results that after a certain time the living words, into which we had as it were transfused our heart's blood, were drained of any meaning. Thereafter, we went on copying them mechanically, trying, through the dead phrases, to convey some notion of our ordeal, and in the long run, to these sterile, reiterated monologues, these futile colloquies with a blank wall, even the banal formulas of a telegram came to seem preferable. Also, after some days, when it was clear that no one had the least hope of being able to leave our town, inquiries began to be made whether the return of people who had gone away before the outbreak would be permitted. After some days' consideration of the matter, the authorities replied affirmatively. They pointed out, however, that in no case would persons be allowed to return to leave the town again. Once here, they would have to stay, whatever happened. Some families, actually very few, refused to take the position seriously, and in their eagerness to have their absent members of the family with them again, cast prudence to the winds and wired to them to take this opportunity of returning. But very soon, those who were prisoners of the plague realized the terrible danger to which they would expose their relatives, and sadly resigned themselves to their absence. At the height of the epidemic, we saw only one case in which natural emotions overcame the fear of death in a particularly painful form. It was not, as might be expected, the case of two young people whose passion made them yearn for each other's nearness at whatever cost of pain. The two were old Dr. Castell and his wife, and they had been married for very many years. M. Castell had gone on a visit to a neighboring town some days before the epidemic started. They weren't one of those exemplary married couples of the Darby and Joanne pattern. On the contrary, the narrator has grounds for saying that, in all probability, neither partner felt strange sure the marriage was all that could be desired. But this ruthless, protracted separation enabled them to realize that they could not live apart, and in the sudden glow of this discovery, the risk of plague seemed insignificant. That was an exception. For most people, it was obvious that the separation must last until the end of the epidemic. And for every one of us the ruling emotion of his life, which he had imagined he knew through and through. The people of Iran, as has been said, have simple passions, took on a new aspect. Husbands who had complete faith in their wives found, to their surprise, that they were jealous, and lovers had the same experience. Men who had pictured themselves as Don Juans became models of fidelity. Sons who had lived beside their mothers, hardly giving them a glance, fell to picturing with poignant regret each wrinkle in the absent face that memory cast upon the screen. This drastic, clean-cut deprivation and our complete ignorance of what the future held in store has taken us unawares. We were unable to react against the mute appeal of presenceness, still so near and already so far, which haunted us day long. In fact, our suffering was twofold, our own to start with, and then the imagined suffering of the absent one, son, mother, wife, or mistress. Under other circumstances, our townsfolk would probably have been an outlet in increasing activity, a more sociable life, but the plague forced inactivity on them, limiting their movements to the same dull round inside the town, and throwing them, day after day, on the elusive solace of their memories. For in their aimless walks they kept on coming back to the same streets, and usually, owing to the smallness of the town, these were streets in which, in happier days, they had walked with those who were now absent. Thus the first thing that plague brought to our town was exile, and the narrator is convinced that he can set down here, as holding good for all, the feeling he personally had and to which many of his friends confessed. It was undoubtedly the feeling of exile, that sensation of a void within which never left us, that irrational longing to hark back to the past or else to speed up the march of time, and those keen shafts of memory that stung like fire. Sometimes we toyed with our imagination, composing ourselves to wait for the ring at the bell, announcing somebody's return, or for the sound of a familiar footstep on the stairs. But though we may deliberately stay at home at the hour when the traveler coming by the evening train would normally have arrived, and though we may contrive to forget for the moments that no trains were running, that game of make-believe, for obvious reasons, could not last. Always a moment came when we had to face the fact that no trains were coming in. And then we realized that the separation was destined to continue. We had no choice but to come to terms with the days ahead. In short, we returned to our prison house. We had nothing left us but the past, and even if some were tempted to live in the future, they had speedily to abandon the idea anyhow, as soon as could be, once they felt the wounds that the imagination inflicts on those who yield themselves to it. It is noteworthy that our townspeople very quickly desisted, even in public, from a habit one might have expected them to form, that of trying to figure out the probable duration of their exile. The reason was this: when the most pessimistic had fixed at it, say 6 months, when they had drunk in advance the dregs of bitterness of those 6 black months, and painfully screwed up their courage to the sticking place, straining all their remaining energy to endure vitality the long ordeal of all those weeks and days. When they had done this, Some friend they met, an article in a newspaper, a vague suspicion or a flash of foresight would suggest that, after all, there was no reason why the epidemic shouldn't last more than 6 months. Why not a year, or even more? At such moments, the collapse of their courage, willpower, and endurance was so abrupt that they felt they could never drag themselves out of the pit of despond into which they had fallen. Therefore, they forced themselves never to think about the problematic day of escape, to cease looking to the future, and always to keep, so to speak, their eyes fixed on the ground at their feet. But naturally enough, this prudence, this habit of fainting with their predicament and refusing to put up a fight, was ill rewarded. For, while averting that revulsion which they found so unbearable, they also deprived themselves of those redeeming moments, frequent enough when all is told, when by conjuring up pictures of a reunion to be, they could forget about the plague. Thus, in a middle course between these heights and depths, they drifted through life rather than lived, the prey of aimless days and sterile memories, like wandering shadows that could have required substance only by connecting to root themselves in the solid earth of their distress. Thus, too, they came to know the incorrigible sorrow of all prisoners and exiles, which is to live in company with a memory that serves no purpose. Even the past, of which they thought incessantly, had a savor only of regret, for they would have wished to add to it all that they regretted having left undone, while they might yet have done it, with the man or woman whose return they now awaited, just as in all the activities, even the relatively happy ones, of their life as prisoners they kept vainly trying to include the absent one. And thus, there was always something missing in their lives. Hostile to the past, impatient of the present, and cheated of the future, we were much like those whom men's justice, or hatred, forces to live behind prison bars. Thus the only way of escaping from that intolerable leisure was to let the trains running again in one's imagination, and in filling the silence with the fancied tickle of a doorbell, in practice, obstinately mute. Still, if it was an exile, it was, for most of us, exile in one's own home. And though the narrator experienced only the common form of exile, he cannot forget the case of those who, like Rambert the journalist and a good many others, had to endure an aggravated deprivation, since, being travelers caught by the plague and forced to say where they were cut off both from the person with whom they wanted to be with, and from their homes as well. In the general exile they were the most exiled, since while time gave rise for them, as for us all, to the suffering appropriate to it, there was also for them the space factor. They were obsessed by it, and at every moment knocked their heads against the walls of this huge and alien lazar house secluding them from their lost homes. These were the people, no doubt, whom one often saw wandering forlornly in the dusky town at all hours of the day, silently invoking nightfalls known to them alone, and the daysprings of their happier land. And they fed their despondency with fleeting intimations, messages as disconcerting as a flight of swallows, a dewfall at sundown, or those queer glints the sun sometimes dapples on empty streets. As for that outside world, which can always offer an escape from everything, they shut their eyes to it, bent as they were on cherishing the all-too-real phantoms of their imagination, and conjuring up with all their might pictures of a land where a special play of light, 2 or 3 hills, a favorite tree, a woman's smile, comprised for them a world that nothing could replace. To come at last, and more specifically to the case of parted lovers, whose present the greatest interest and of whom the narrator is, perhaps, better qualified to speak. Their minds were the prey of different emotions, notably remorse, for their present position enabled them to take stock of their feelings with a sort of feverish objectivity. And, in these conditions, it was rare for them not to detect their own shortcomings. What first brought these home to them was the trouble they experienced in summoning up any clear picture of what the absent one was doing. They came to deplore their ignorance of the way in which that person used to spend his or her days, and reproached themselves for having troubled too little about this in the past, and for having affected to think that, for a lover, the occupation of the loved one when they are not together could be a matter of indifference and not a source of joy. Once this had been brought home to them, they could retrace the course of their love and see where it had fallen short. In normal times, all of us know, whether consciously or not, that there is no love which can't be bettered. Nevertheless, we reconcile ourselves more or less easily to the fact that ours has never risen above the average. But memory is less disposed to compromise, and in a very definite way. This misfortune which has come from outside and befallen a whole town did more than inflict on us an intermittent distress with which we might be indignant. It also incited us to create our own suffering, and thus to accept frustration as a natural state. This was one of the tricks the pestilence had of diverting attention and confounding issues. Thus, each of us had to be content to live only for the day, alone under the vast indifference of the sky. This sense of being abandoned, which might in time have given characters a finer temper, began, however, by sapping them to the point of futility. For instance, some of our fellow citizens became subject to a curious kind of servitude, which put them at the mercy of the sun and the rain. Looking at them, you had an impression that, for the first time in their lives, they were becoming, as some would say, weather-conscious. A burst of sunshine was enough to make them feel delighted with the world, while rainy days gave a dark cast to their faces and their mood. A few weeks before, they had been free of this absurd subservience to the weather, because they had not to face life alone. The person they were living with held, to some extent, the foreground of their little world. But from now on, it was different. They seemed at the mercy of the sky's caprices. In other words, suffered and hoped irrationally. Moreover, in this extremity of solitude, none could count on any help from his neighbor. Each had to bear the load of his troubles alone. If, by some chance, one of us tried to unburden himself or to say something about his feelings, the reply he got, whatever it might be, usually wounded him. And then it dawned on him that he and the man with him weren't talking about the same thing. For while he himself spoke from the depths of long days of brooding upon his personal distress, and the image he had tried to impart had been slowly shaped and proved in the fires of passion and regret, this meant nothing to the man with whom he was speaking, who pictured a conventional emotion, a grief that is traded in the marketplace, mass-produced. Whether friendly or hostile, the reply always missed fire, and the attempt to communicate had to be given up. This was true one of those least for whom silence was unbearable, and since the others could not find a truly expressive word, they resigned themselves to using the current coin of language, the commonplaces of plain narrative, of anecdote, and of their daily paper. So in these cases too, even the sincerest grief had to make do with the set phrases of ordinary conversation. Only on these terms could the prisoners of the plague ensure the sympathy of their concierge and the interest of their hearers. Nevertheless, and this point is most important, however bitter their distress and however heavy their hearts, for all their emptiness, it can be truly said of these exiles that in the early period of the plague they could account themselves privileged. For at the precise moment when the residents of the town began to panic, their thoughts were wholly fixed on the person whom they longed to meet again. The egoism of love made them immune to the general distress, and if they thought of the plague, it was only insofar as it might threaten to make their separation eternal. Thus, in the very heart of the epidemic, they maintained a saving indifference, which one was tempted to take for composure. Their despair saved them from panic. Thus their misfortune had a good side. For instance, if it happened that one of them was carried off by the disease, it was almost always without his having had time to realize it. Snatched suddenly from his long, silent communion with the wrath of memory, he was plunged straightway into the dead-set silence of all. He'd had no time for anything. While our townspeople were trying to come to terms with their sudden isolation, the plague was posting sentries at the gates and turning away ships bound for Iran. No vehicle had entered the town since the gates were closed. From that day onward, one had the impression that all cars were moving in circles. The harbor, too, presented a strange appearance to those who looked down on it from the top of the boulevards. The commercial activity that hitherto made it one of the chief ports on the coast had ceased abruptly. Only a few ships, detained in quarantine, were anchored in the bay. But the gaunt, idle cranes on the wharves, tip carts lying on their sides, neglected heaps of sacks and barrels, all testified that commerce, too, had died of plague. In spite of such unusual sights, our townsfolk apparently found it hard to grasp what was happening to them. There were feelings all could share, such as fear and separation, But personal interests, too, continued to occupy the foreground of their thoughts. Nobody as yet had really acknowledged to himself what the disease connotated. Most people were chiefly aware of what ruffled the normal tenor of their lives, or affected their interests. They were worried and irritated, but these are not feelings with which to confront plague. Their first reaction, for instance, was to abuse the authorities. The prefect's riposte to criticisms echoed by the press. Could not the regulations be modified and made less stringent? Was something unexpected. Hitherto, neither the newspapers nor the Ranstock Information Bureau had been given any official statistics relating to the epidemic. Now the prefect supplied them daily to the Bureau, with the request that they should be broadcast once a week. In this, too, the reaction of the public was slower than might have been expected. Thus the bare statement that 302 deaths had taken place in the third week of plague failed to strike their imagination. For one thing, all the 302 deaths might not have been due to plague. Also, no one in the town had any idea of the average weekly death rate in ordinary times. The population of the town was about 200,000. There was no knowing if the present death rate was really so abnormal. This is, in fact, the kind of statistics that nobody ever troubles much about, notwithstanding that its interest is obvious. The public lacked, in short, standards of comparison. It was only as time passed and the steady rise in the death rate could not be ignored that public opinion became alive to the truth. For in the fifth week there were 321 deaths, and 345 in the sixth. These figures, anyhow, spoke for themselves. Yet they were not sensational enough to prevent our townsfolk, perturbed though they were, from persisting in the idea that what was happening was a sort of accident. Disagreeable enough, but certainly of a temporary order. So they went on strolling about the town as usual, and sitting at the tables on cafe terraces. Generally speaking, they did not lack courage, brandied more jokes than lamentations, and made a show of accepting cheerfully unpleasantness that obviously could only be passing. In short, they kept up appearances. However, toward the end of the month, about the time of the week of prayer which will be described later on, there were more serious developments, altering the whole aspect of the town. To begin with, the prefect took measures in controlling the traffic and the food supply. Gasoline was rationed and restrictions were placed on the sale of foodstuffs. Reductions were ordered in the use of electricity. Only necessities were brought by road or air to Iran. Thus the traffic thinned out progressively until hardly any private cars were on the roads. Luxury shops closed overnight, and others began to put up sold-out notices, while crowds of buyers stood waiting at their doors. Iran assumed a novel appearance. You saw more pedestrians, and in the slack hours, numbers of people, reduced to idleness because shops and many good offices were closed, crowded the streets and cafes. For the present, they were not unemployed, merely on holiday. So it was that on fine days, toward 3 in the afternoon, Iran brought to mind a city where public rejoicings are in progress, shops are shut, and traffic is stopped to give a merry-making populace the freedom of the streets. Naturally, the picture houses benefited by the situation, and made money hand over fist. They had one difficulty, however, to provide a change of program, since the circulation of films in the region had been suspended. After a fortnight, the various cinemas were obliged to exchange films, and after a further lapse of time, to show always the same program. In spite of this, their takings did not fall off. The cafes, thanks to the big stocks accumulated in a town where the wine and liquor trade holds pride of place, were equally able to cater for their patrons. And to tell the truth, there was much heavy drinking. One of the cafes had the brilliant idea of putting up a slogan: "The best protection against infection is a bottle of good wine," which confirmed an already prevalent opinion that alcohol is a safeguard against infectious disease. Every night, toward 2 a.m., quite a number of drunken men, ejected from the cafes, staggered down the streets, vociferating optimism. Yet all these changes were, in one sense, so fantastic and had been made so precipitately that it wasn't easy to regard them as likely to have made any permanence, with the result that we went on focusing our attention on our personal feelings. When leaving the hospital 2 days after the gates were closed, Dr. Ryu met Kotad in the street. The little man was beaming with satisfaction. Ryu congratulated him on his appearance. "Yes," Kotad said. "I'm feeling very fit. Never was fitter in my life. But tell me, Doctor, this blasted plague, what's about it? Getting to look mighty serious, isn't it?" When the doctor nodded, he continued exuberantly. "And there's no reason for it to stop now. This town's going to be in an unholy mess by the looks of things." They walked a little way together. Kotad told the story of a grocer in his street who had laid by masses of canned provisions with the idea of selling them later on at a big profit. When the ambulance men came to fetch him, he had several dozen cans of meat under his bed. "He died in the hospital. There's no money in plague, that's sure." Kotad was a mine of stories of this kind, true or false, about the epidemic. One of them was about a man with all the symptoms and running a high fever who dashed out into the street, flung himself on the first woman he met, and embraced her, yelling that he'd got it. "Good for him," was Kotad's comment, but his next remark seemed to belie his gleeful exclamation. "Anyhow, we'll all be nuts before long, unless I'm much mistaken." It was on the afternoon of this same day that Grand at last unburdened himself to Ryu. Noticing Ryu's photograph on the desk, he looked at the doctor inquiringly. Ryu told him that his wife was under treatment in a sanatorium some distance from the town. "In one way," Grand said. "That's lucky." The doctor agreed that it was lucky in a sense, but he added, the great thing was that his wife should recover. "Yes," Grand said. "I understand." And then, for the first time since Ryu had made his acquaintance, he became quite voluble. Though he still had trouble over his words, he succeeded nearly always in finding them. Indeed, it was as if for years he'd been thinking over what he now said. When in his teens, he had married a very young girl, one of a poor family living nearby. It was, in fact, in order to marry that he'd abandoned his studies and taken up his current job. Neither he nor Jian had ever stirred from their part of the town. In his courting days, he used to go and see her at her home, and the family were inclined to make fun of her bashful, silent admirer. Her father was a railroadman. When off duty, he spent most of the time seated in a corner beside the window, gazing meditatively at the passers-by, his enormous hands spread out on his thighs. His wife was always busy with domestic duties, in which Jian gave her a hand. Jian was so tiny that it always made Gran nervous to see her crossing a street. The vehicles bearing down on her looked so gigantic. Then one day, shortly before Christmas, they went out for a short walk together and stopped to admire a gaily decorated shop window. After gazing ecstatically at it for some moments, Jian turned to him. "Oh, isn't it lovely?" He squeezed her wrist. It was thus that the marriage had come about. The rest of the story, to Gran's thinking, was very simple. The common lot of married couples. You get married, you go on living a bit longer, you work. And you work so hard that it makes you forget to love. As the head of the office where Grand was employed hadn't kept his promise, Jian, too, had to work outside. At this point, a little imagination was needed to grasp what Grand was trying to convey. Owing largely to fatigue, he gradually lost grip of himself, and had less and less to say, and failed to keep alive the feeling in his wife that she was loved. An overworked husband, poverty, the gradual loss of hope in a better future, silent evenings at home. What chance had any passion of surviving such conditions? Probably Jian had suffered, and yet she'd stayed. Of course, one may often suffer a long time without knowing it. Thus, years went by. Then, one day, she left him. Naturally, she hadn't gone alone. "I was very fond of you, but now I'm so tired. I'm not happy to go, but one needn't be happy to make another start." That, more or less, was what she'd said in her letter. Gran, too, had suffered. And he, too, might, as Ryu pointed out, have made a fresh start. But no, he had lost faith. Only he couldn't stop thinking about her. What he'd have liked to do was write her a letter justifying himself. "But it's not easy," he told Ryu. "I've been thinking it over for years. While we loved each other, we didn't need words to make ourselves understood. But people didn't love forever. A time came when I should have found the words to keep her with me. Only I couldn't. Grant produced from his pocket something that looked like a check duster, and blew his nose noisily. Then he wiped his mustache. Ryu gazed at him in silence. "Forgive me, Doctor," Grant added hastily. "But how shall I put it? I feel you're to be trusted. That's why I can talk to you about these kinds of things. And then, you see, I get all worked up." Obviously, Grant's thoughts were leagues away from the plague. That evening, Ryu sent a telegram to his wife telling her that the town was closed, that she must go on taking great care of herself, and that she was in his thoughts. One evening, when he was leaving the hospital, it was about 3 weeks after the closing of the gates, Ryu found a young man waiting for him in the street. "You remember me, don't you?" Ryu believed he did, but couldn't quite place him. "I called on you just before this trouble started," the young man said, "for information about the living conditions in the Arab quarter. My name is Raymond Rambert." "Ah, yes, of course. Well, you've now the makings of a good story for your paper." Rambert, who gave the impression of being a much less self-assured than he had seemed on the first occasion when they met, said it wasn't that he'd come about. He wanted to know if the doctor would kindly give him some help. "I must apologize," he continued, "but really I don't know a soul here, and the local representative of my paper is a complete dud." Ryu said he had to go to a dispensary in the center of the town, and suggested that they should walk together. Their way lay through the narrow streets of the Negro district. Evening was coming on, but the town, once so noisy at this hour, was strangely still. The only sounds were some bugle calls echoing through the air, still golden with the end of daylight. The army, anyhow, was making a show of carrying on as usual. Meanwhile, as they walked down the steep little streets flanked by blue, mauve, and saffron yellow walls, Rambert talked incessantly, as if his nerves were out of hand. He had left his wife in Paris, he said. Well, she wasn't actually his wife, but it came to the same thing. The moment the town was put into quarantine, he had sent her a wire. His impression then was that the state of things was quite temporary, and all he'd tried to do was get a letter through to her. But the post office officials had vetoed this. His colleagues of the local press said they could do nothing for him, and a clerk in the prefect's office had laughed in his face. It was only after waiting in line for a couple of hours that he had managed to get a telegram accepted. All goes well. Hope to see you soon. But next morning, when he woke up, it had dawned on him that, after all, there was absolutely no knowing how long this business was going to last. So he decided to leave the town at once. Being able, thanks to his professional status, to pull some strings, he had secured an interview with a high official in the prefect's office. He had explained that his presence in Iran was purely accidental. He had no connection with the town, and no reasons for staying in it. That being so, he surely was entitled to leave, even if, once outside the town, he had to undergo a spell of quarantine. The official told him he quite appreciated his position, but no exceptions could be made. He would, however, see if anything could be done, though he could hold out little hope of a quick decision, as the authorities were taking a very serious view of the situation. "But confound it!" Rambert exclaimed. "I don't belong here." "Quite so. Anyhow, let's hope the epidemic will soon be over." Finally, he had tried to console Rambert by pointing out that, as a journalist, he had an excellent subject to his hand in Iran. Indeed, when one came to think of it, no event, however disagreeable in some ways, but had its bright side. Whereat Rambert had shrugged his shoulders petulantly and walked out. They had come to the center of the town. "It's so damn silly, Doctor, isn't it? The truth is, I wasn't brought into the world to write newspaper articles. But it's quite likely I was brought into the world to live with a woman. That's reasonable enough, innit?" Ryu replied courteously that there might be something in what he said. The central boulevards were not so crowded as usual. The few people about were hurrying to distant homes. Not a smile was to be seen on any face. Ryu guessed that this was a result of the latest Ransdorf announcement. After 24 hours, our townspeople would begin to hope again. But on the days when they were announced, the statistics were too fresh in everybody's memory. The truth, Rambert remarked abruptly, is that she and I had been together only a short time, and we suit one another perfectly. When Ryu said nothing, he continued, I can see I'm boring you. Sorry. All I wanted to know is whether you couldn't possibly give me a certificate stating that I haven't got this damn disease. It might make things easier, methinks. Ryu nodded. A small boy had just run against his legs and fallen. He set him on his feet again. Walking on, they came to the place d'armes, grey with dust, where the palms and fig trees drooped despondently around a statue of the Republic, which too was coated with grime and dust. They stopped beside the statue. Ryu stamped his feet on the flagstones to shake off the coat of white dust that had gathered on them. His hat pushed slightly back, his shirt collar gaped under a loosely knotted tie, his cheeks ill-shaven. The journalist had the sulky, stubborn look of a young man who feels himself deeply injured. Please don't doubt I understand you, Ryu said, but you must see your argument doesn't hold water. I can't give you that certificate because I don't know whether you have the disease or not. And even if I did, how could I certify that between the moment of leaving my consulting room and your arrival at the prefect's office you wouldn't be infected? And even if I did, and even if you did, even if I gave you a certificate, it wouldn't help. Why not? Because there are thousands of people placed as you are in this town, and there can't be any question of allowing them to leave it. Even supposing they haven't got the plague. That's not a sufficient reason. Oh, I know it's an absurd situation, but we're all involved in it, and we've got to accept it as it is. But I don't belong here. Unfortunately, from now on you'll belong here, like everybody else. Rambert raised his voice a little. But damn it, Doctor, can't you see it's a matter of common human feeling? Or don't you realize what this sort of separation means to people who are fond of one another? Ryu was silent for a moment, then said he understood it perfectly. He wished nothing better than that Rambert should be allowed to return to his wife, and all who loved one another and were parted should come together again. Only the law was the law. Plague had broken out, and he could only do what had to be done. No, Rambert said bitterly. You can't understand. You're using the language of reason, not of the heart. You live in a world of abstractions. The doctor glanced up at the statue of the Republic, then said he did not know if he was using the language of reason, but he knew he was using the language of the facts as everybody could see them, which wasn't necessarily the same thing. The journalist tugged at his tie to straighten it. So I take it, I can't count on help from you. Very good. But his tone was challenging. Leave this town I shall. The doctor repeated that he quite understood, but all that was none of his business. Excuse me, but it is your business. Rambert raised his voice again. I approached you because I'd been told you played a large part in drawing up the orders that have been issued. So I thought that in one case anyhow you could unmake what you'd helped to make. But you don't care. You never gave a thought to anybody. You didn't take the case of people who are separated into account. Ryu admitted that this was true up to a point. He'd preferred not to take such cases into account. I see now, Rambert exclaimed. You'll soon be talking about the interests of the general public. But public welfare is merely the sum total of the private welfares of each of us. The doctor seemed abruptly to come out of a dream. Oh, come, he said. There's that, but there's much more to it than that. It doesn't do to rush to conclusions, you know. But you've no reason to feel angered. I assure you that if you find a way out of your quandary, I shall be extremely pleased. Only there are things that my official position debars me from doing. Rambert tossed his hat petulantly. Yes, I was wrong to show annoyance, and I've taken up too much of your time already. Ryu asked him to let him know how he got on his project, and not to bear him a grudge for not having been more amenable. He was sure, he added, that there was some common ground on which they could meet. Rambert looked perplexed. Then, yes, he said after a short silence. I rather think so, too, in spite of myself and of all you've just been saying. He paused. Still, I can't agree with you. Pulling down his hat over his eyes, he walked quickly away. Ryu saw him enter the hotel where Taro was staying. After a moment, the doctor gave a slight nod, as if approving of some thought that had crossed his mind. Yes, the journalist was right in refusing to be balked of happiness, but was he right in reproaching him, Ryu, with living in a world of abstractions? Could the term abstraction really apply to these days he spent in his hospital while the plague was battering on the town, raising its death toll to 500 victims a week? Yes, an element of abstraction, of a divorce from reality, entered into such calamities. Still, when abstraction sets to killing you, you've got to get busy with it, and so much Ryu knew that this wasn't the easiest course. Running this auxiliary hospital, for instance, of which he was in charge, there was now 3 such hospitals, was no light task. He had had an anteroom, leading into his surgery, installed, equipped for dealing with patients on arrival. The floor had been excavated and replaced by a shallow lake of water and chrysalic acid, in the center of which was a sort of island made of bricks. The patient was carried to the island, rapidly undressed, and his clothes dropped into the disinfectant water. After being washed, dried, and dressed in one of the coarse hospital nightshirts, he was taken to Ryu for examination, then carried to one of the wards. This hospital, a requisitioned schoolhouse, now contained 500 beds, almost all of which were occupied. After the reception of the patients, which he personally supervised, Ryu injected serum, lanced buboes, checked the statistics again, and returned for his afternoon consultations. Only when night was setting in did he start on his round of visits, and never got home until a very late hour. On the previous night, his mother, when handing him a telegram from his wife, had remarked that his hands were shaking. "Yes," he said, "but it's only a matter of sticking to it, and my nerves will steady down, you see." He had a robust constitution, and as yet wasn't really tired. Still, his visits, for one thing, were beginning to put a great strain on his endurance. Once the epidemic was diagnosed, the patient had to be evacuated forthwith. Then indeed began abstraction and a tussle with the family, who knew they could not see the sick man again until he was dead or cured. "Have some pity, doctor!" It was Mrs. Lorette, mother of the chambermaid at Taro's hotel, who made the appeal. An unnecessary appeal. Of course he had pity. But what purpose could it serve? He had to telephone, and soon the ambulance could be heard clanging down the street. At first the neighbors used to open windows and watch. Later they promptly shut them. Then came a second phase of conflict, tears and pleadings. Abstraction, in a word. In those fever-hot, nerve-ridden sick rooms, crazy scenes took place. But the issue was always the same. The patient was removed. Then Ryu too could leave. In the early days, he had merely telephoned, then rushed off to see other patients, without waiting for the ambulance. But no sooner was he gone than the family locked and barred their doors, preferring contact with the plague to a parting whose issue they now knew only too well. There followed objurgations, screams, batterings on the door, action by the police, and later armed force. The patient was taken by storm. Thus, during the first few weeks, Ryu was compelled to stay with the patient till the ambulance came. Later, when each doctor was accompanied by a volunteer police officer, Ryu could hurry away to the next patient. But to begin with, every evening was like that evening when he was called in for Mrs. Lorette's daughter. He was shown into a small apartment decorated with fans and artificial flowers. The woman greeted him with a faltering smile. "Oh, I do hope it's not the fever everyone's talking about." Lifting the coverlet and chemise, he gazed in silence at the red blotches on the girl's thighs and stomach, the swollen ganglia. After one glance, the mother broke into shrill, uncontrollable cries of grief. And every evening mothers wailed thus, with a distraught abstraction, as their eyes fell on those fatal stigmata on limbs and bellies. Every evening hands gripped Ryu's arms. There was a rush of useless words, promises, and tears. Every evening the nearing tocsin of the ambulance provoked scenes as vain as every form of grief. Ryu had nothing to look forward to but a long sequence of such scenes, renewed again and again. Yes, plague, like abstraction, was monotonous. Perhaps only one factor changed, and that was Ryu himself. Standing at the foot of the statue of the Republic that evening, he felt it. All he was conscious of was a bleak indifference steadily gaining on him as he gazed at the door of the hotel Rambert had just entered. After these wearing weeks, after all those nightfalls when the townsfolk poured out into the streets to roam them aimlessly, Ryu had learned that he need no longer steel himself against pity. One grows out of pity when it's useless, and in this feeling that his heart had slowly closed in on itself, the doctor found a solace, his only solace, for the almost unendurable burden of his days. This, he knew, would make his task easier, and therefore he was glad of it. When he came home at 2 in the morning and his mother was shocked at the blank look he gave her, she was deploring precisely the sole alleviation Ryu could then experience. To fight abstraction, you must have something of it in your own makeup. But how could Rambert be expected to grasp that? Abstraction for him was all that stood in the way of his happiness. Indeed, Ryu had to admit the journalist was right, in one sense. But he knew, too, that abstraction sometimes proves itself stronger than happiness, and then, if only then, it has to be taken into account. And this was what was going to happen to Rambert, as the doctor was to learn when, much later, Rambert told him more about himself. Thus he was enabled to follow, and on a different plane, the dreary struggle in progress between each man's happiness and the abstractions of the plague, which constituted the whole life of our town over a long period of time. But where some saw abstraction, others saw the truth. The first month of the plague ended gloomily, with a violent recrudescence of the disease and a dramatic sermon preached by Father Panelot, the Jesuit priest who had given an arm to old Michel when he was tottering home at the start of his illness. Father Panelot had already made his mark with frequent contributions to the Orange Geographical Society. These dealt chiefly with ancient inscriptions, on which he was an authority. But he had also reached a wider, non-specialist public with a series of lectures on present-day individualism. In these, he had shown himself a stalwart champion of Christian doctrine, and its most precise and purest, equally remote from modern laxity and the obscurantism of the past. On these occasions, he had not shrunk from trouncing his hearers with some vigorous home truths. Hence his local celebrity. Toward the end of the month, the ecclesiastical authorities in our town resolved to do battle against the plague with the weapons appropriate to them, and organized a week of prayer. These manifestations of public piety were to be concluded on Sunday by a high mass celebrated under the auspices of Saint Roch, the plague-stricken saint, and Father Panelot was asked to preach the sermon. For a fortnight, he desisted from the research work on St. Augustine and the African Church that had won for him a high place in his order. A man of passionate, fiery temperament, he flung himself wholeheartedly into the task assigned him. The sermon was a topic of conversation long before it was delivered, and, in its way, it marks an important date in the history of the period. There were large attendances at the services of the week of prayer. It must not, however, be assumed that in normal times the townsfolk of Iran are particularly devout. On Sunday mornings, for instance, sea bathing competes seriously with church-going. Nor must it be thought that they had a great light and a sudden change of heart. But for one thing, now that the town was closed and the harbor out of bounds, there was no question of bathing. Moreover, they were quite in an exceptional frame of mind, and though in their heart of hearts they were far from recognizing the enormity of what had come on them, they couldn't help but feeling, for obvious reasons, that decidedly something had changed. Nevertheless, many continued hoping that the epidemic would soon die out and they and their families be spared. Thus they felt under no obligation to make any change in their habits as yet. Plague was for them an unwelcome visitant, bound to take its leave one day as unexpectedly as it had come. Alarmed, but far from desperate, they hadn't yet reached the phase when plague would seem to them the very tissue of their existence, when they forgot the lives that until now it had been given them to lead. In short, they were waiting for the turn of events. With regard to religion, as to many other problems, plague had induced in them a curious frame of mind. As remote from indifference as from fervor, the best name to give it, perhaps, might be objectivity. Most people who took part in the week of prayer would have echoed a remark made by one of the churchgoers in Dr. Ryu's hearing. Anyhow, it can't do any harm. Even Thoreau, after recording in his notebook that in such cases the Chinese fell to playing tambourines before the genius of plague, observed that there was no means of telling whether, in practice, tambourines proved more efficacious than prophylactic measures. He merely added that, to decide the point, we should need to ascertain if a genus of plague actually existed, and our ignorance on this point nullified any opinions we might form. In any case, the cathedral is practically always full of worshippers throughout the week of prayer. For the first 2 or 3 days, many stayed outside, under the palms and pomegranate trees in the garden in front of the porch, and listened from a distance to the swelling tide of prayers and evocations where backwash filled the neighboring streets. But once an example had been given, they began to enter the cathedral and join timidly in the responses. And on the Sunday of the sermon, a huge congregation filled with the nave, overflowing onto the steps and precincts. The sky had clouded up the previous day, and now it was raining heavily. Those in the open unfurled umbrellas. The air inside the cathedral was heavy with fumes of incense and the smell of wet clothes when Father Panelot stepped into the pulpit. He was a stockily built man, of medium height, when he leaned on the edge of the pulpit, grasping the woodwork with his big hands. All one saw was a black, massive torso, and above it, 2 rosy cheeks overhung by steel-rimmed spectacles. He had a powerful, rather emotional delivery, which carried to a great distance, and when he launched at the congregation his opening phrase in clear, emphatic tones, "Calamity has come on you, my brethren, and my brethren, you deserved it," there was a flutter that extended into the crowd massed in the rain outside the porch. In strict logic, what came next did not seem to follow from this dramatic opening. Only as the sermon proceeded did it become apparent to the congregation that, by a skillful oratorical device, Father Panelot had launched at them, like a fisticuff, the gist of his whole discourse. After launching it, he went on at once to quote a text from Exodus relating to the plague of Egypt, and said, "The first time this scourge appears in history, it was wielded to strike down the enemies of God. Pharaoh set himself against the divine will, and the plague beat him to his knees. Thus, from the dawn of recorded history, the scourge of God has humbled the proud of heart and laid low these who harden themselves against him. Ponder this well, my friends, and fall on your knees." The downpour had increased in violence, striking through a silence intensified by the drumming of raindrops on the chancel windows, carried such conviction that after a momentary hesitation, some of the worshippers slipped forward from their seats onto their knees. Others felt it right to follow their example, and the movement gradually spread until presently everyone was kneeling, from end to end of the cathedral. No sound except an occasional creak of chairs accompanied the movement. Then Panelot drew himself up to his full height, took a deep breath, and continued his sermon in a voice that gathered strength as it proceeded. "If today the plague is in your midst, that is because the hour has struck for taking thought. The just man must have no fear, but the evildoer has good cause to tremble. For plague is the fail of God, and the world his threshing floor, and impeccably he will thresh his harvest until the wheat is separated from the chaff. There will be more chaff than wheat, few chosen of the many called. Yet this calamity was not willed by God. Too long this world of ours has convened at evil. Too long has it counted on the divine mercy, on God's forgiveness. Repentance was enough, men thought. Nothing was forbidden. Everyone felt comfortably assured, when the day came, he would surely turn from his sins and repent. Pending that day, the greatest course was to surrender all along the line. Divine compassion would do the rest. For a long while God gazed down on this town with eyes of compassion, but he grew weary of waiting. His eternal hope was too long deferred, and now he has turned his face away from us. And so, God's light withdrawn, we walk in darkness, in the thick darkness of this plague. Someone in the congregation gave a little snort, like that of a restive horse. After a short silence, the preacher continued in a lower tone. We read in the golden legend that in the time of King Umberto, Italy was swept by plague and its greatest ravages took place in Rome and Pavia. So dreadful were these that the living hardly sufficed to bury the dead. And a good angel was made visible to human eyes, giving his orders to an evil angel who bore a great hunting spear, and bidding him strike the houses. And as many strokes as he dealt a house, so many dead were carried out of it. Here Panelo stretched forth his two short arms toward the open porch, as if pointing to something behind the tumbling curtain of the rain. "My brothers," he cried, "that fatal hunt is up, and harrying our streets today. See him there, that angel of pestilence comely as Lucifer, shining like evil's very self. He is hovering above your roofs with his great spear in his right hand poised to strike, while his left hand is stretched towards one or other of your houses. Maybe at this very moment the finger is pointing to your door, the red spear crashing on its panels, and even now the plague is entering your home, and settling down in your bedroom to await your return. Patent and watchful, inelucutable as the order of the scheme of things, it bides its time. No earthly power, nay, not even, mark me well, the vaunted might of human science can avail you to avert that hand once it is stretched towards you. And winnowed like corn the blood-stained threshing floor of suffering, you will be cast away with the chaff." At this point, the father reverted with heightened eloquence to the symbol of the flail. He bade his hearers picture a huge wooden bar whirling above the town, striking at random, swinging up again in a shower of drops of blood, and spreading carnage and suffering on earth, for the seed time that shall prepare the harvest of the truth. At the end of his long phrase, Father Panelo paused. His hair was straggling over his forehead, his body shaken by tremors that his hands communicated to the pulpit. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, but vibrant with accusation. "Yes, the hour has come for serious thought. You fondly imagined it was enough to visit God on Sundays, and thus you could make free of your weekdays. You believed some brief formalities, some bendings of the knee would recompose him well enough for your criminal indifference. But God is not mocked. These brief encounters could not sate the fierce hunger of his love. He wished to see you younger and more often. That is his manner of loving, and indeed it is the only manner of loving. And this is why, wearied of waiting for you to come to him, he loosened you on this visitation, as he has visited all the cities that offended against him since the dawn of history. Now you are learning your lesson, the lesson that was learned by Cain and his offspring, by the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, by Job and Pharaoh, by all that hardened their hearts against him. And like them you have been beholding mankind and with creation with new eyes, since the gates of this city closed on you and on the pestilence. Now at last, you know the hour has struck to bend your thoughts to first and last things." A wet wind was sweeping up the nave, making the candle flames bend and flicker. The pugency of burning wax, coughs, a stifled sneeze, rose toward Father Panelo, who, reverting to his exordium with a subtlety that was much appreciated, went on in a calm, almost matter-of-fact voice. "Many of you are wondering, I know, what I am leading up to. I wish to lead you to the truth and teach you to rejoice. Yes, rejoice, in spite of all that I have been telling you. For the first time is past with a helping hand or mere words of good advice could set you on the right path. Today, the truth is a command. It is a red spear sternly pointed to the narrow path, the one way to salvation. And thus, my brothers, at last it is revealed to you, the divine compassion which has ordained good and evil in everything, wrath and pity, the plague and your salvation. This same pestilence which is slaying you works for your good and points your path. Many centuries ago, the Christians of Abyssinia saw in the plague a sure and God-sent means of winning eternal life. Those who were not yet stricken wrapped round them sheets in which men had died of plague, as to make sure of their death. I grant you such a frenzied quest of salvation must not to be commended. It shows an overhaste, indeed a presumptuousness, which we can but deplore. No man should seek to force God's hand or to hurry on the appointed hour, and from a practice that aims at speeding up the order of events which God has ordained unalterably from old time. It is but a step to heresy, yet we can learn a salutary lesson from the zeal, excessive though it was, of those Abyssinian Christians. Much of it is alien to our more enlightened spirits, and yet it gives us a glimpse of that radiant eternal life which glows, a still small flame, in the dark core of human suffering. And this light, too, illuminates the shadowed paths that lead toward deliverance. It reveals the will of God in action, unfalteringly transforming evil into good. And once again today it is leading us through the dark valley of fears and groans toward the holy silence, the well-being of all life. This too, my friends, is the vast consultation I would hold out to you, so that when you leave this house of God you will carry away with you not only words of wrath, but a message, too, of comfort for your hearts. Everyone supposed that the sermon had ended. Outside, the rain had ceased and watery sunshine was yellowing the cathedral square. Vague sounds of voices came from the streets and a low hum of traffic, the speech of an awakening town. Discreetly, with a subdued rustling, the congregation gathered together their belongings. However, the father had a few more words to say. He told them that after making it clear that this plague had come from God for the punishment of their sins, he would not have recourse, in concluding, to an eloquence that, considering the tragic nature of the occasion, would be out of keeping. He hoped and believed that all of them saw now the position in its true light. But before leaving the pulpit, he would like to tell them of something that he had been reading in an old chronicle of the Black Death at Marseille. In it, Matthew Marais, the chronicler, laments his lot. He says that he had been cast into hell by language without succor and without hope. Well, Matthew Marais was blind. Never more intensely than today than he, Father Panelot, felt the imminence of divine succor and Christian hope granted to all alike. He hoped against hope that, despite all the horrors of these dark days, despite the groans of men and women in agony, our fellow citizens would offer up to heaven that one prayer which is truly Christian, a prayer of love, and God would see to the rest. It is hard to say if this sermon had any effect on our townsfolk. M. Othen, the magistrate, assured Dr. Ryu that he had found the preacher's arguments absolutely irrefutable, but not everyone took so unqualified a view. To some, the sermon simply brought home the fact that they had been sentenced for an unknown crime to an indeterminate period of punishment. And while a good many people adapted themselves to confinement and carried on their humdrum lives as before, there were others who rebelled, and whose one idea now was to break loose from the prison house. At first, the fact of being cut off from the outside world was accepted with a more or less good grace, much as people would have put up with any other temporary inconvenience that interfered with only a few of their habits. But now, they had abruptly become aware that they were undergoing a sort of incarceration under that blue dome of sky, already beginning to sizzle in the fires of summer. They had a vague sensation that their whole lives were threatened by the present turn of events. And in the evening, when the cooler air revived their energy, this feeling of being locked in like criminals prompted them sometimes to foolhardy acts. It is noteworthy, this may or may not have been due to mere coincidence, that this Sunday of the sermon marked the beginning of something like a widespread panic in the town, and it took so deep a hold as to lead one to suspect that only now had the true nature of their situation dawned on our townspeople. Seen from this angle, the atmosphere of our town was somewhat changed. But actually, it was a problem whether the change was in the atmosphere or in their hearts. A few days after the sermon, when Ryu, on his way to one of the outlying districts of the town, was discussing the change with Grand, he collided in the darkness with a man who was standing in the middle of the pavement swaying from side to side without trying to advance. At the same moment, the street lamps, which were being lit later and later in the evening, went on suddenly, and a lamp just behind Ryu and his companion threw its full light on the man's face. His eyes were shut and he was laughing soundlessly. Big drops of sweat were rolling down the face convulsed with silent merriment. A lunatic at large, Grand observed. Ryu took his arm and was shepherding him on when he noticed that Grand was trembling violently. If things go on as they are going, Ryu remarked, the whole town will be a madhouse. He felt exhausted. His throat was parched. Let's have a drink. They turned into a small cafe. The only light came from a lamp over the bar. The heavy air had a curious reddish tinge, and for no apparent reason everyone was speaking in undertones. To the doctor's surprise, Grand asked for a small glass of straight liquor, which he drank off at a gulp. Fiery stuff, he observed. Then, a moment later, suggested making a move. Out in the street, it seemed to Ryu that the night was full of whispers. Somewhere in the black depths above the street lamps there was a low soughing that brought to his mind that unseeing flail, threshing incessantly the languid air of which Penelo had spoken. Happily, happily, Ryu muttered, then paused. Grand asked him what he had been going to say. Happily, I've my work. Ah yes, Ryu said. That's something, anyhow. Then, so as to not hear that eerie whistling in the air, he asked Grand if he was getting good results. Well, yes. I think I'm making headway. Having much more to do. Grand began to show an animation unlike his usual self, and his voice took ardor from the liquor he had drunk. I don't know. But that's not the point, Doctor. Yes, I can assure you, that's not the point. It was too dark to see clearly, but Ryu had the impression that he was waving his arms. He seemed to be working himself up to say something, and when he spoke, the words came with a rush. What I really want, Doctor, is this. On the day when the manuscript reaches the publisher, I want him to stand up, after he's read it through, of course, and say to his staff, Gentlemen, hats off! Ryu was dumbfounded, and to add to his amazement, he saw, or seemed to see, the man beside him making as if to take off his hat with a sweeping gesture, bringing his hand to his head, then holding his arm out straight in front of him. That queer whistling overhead seemed to gather force. So you see, Gran added, it's got to be flawless. Though he knew little of the literary world, Ryu had a suspicion that things didn't happen in it quite so picturesquely, that, for instance, publishers do not keep their hats in their offices. But of course, one can never tell, and Ryu preferred to hold his peace. Try as he might to shut his ears to it, he still was listening to that eerie sound above, the whispering of the plague. They had reached the part of town where Grand lived, and as it was on a slight eminence, they felt the cool night breeze fanning their cheeks and at the same time carrying away them from the noises of the town. Grand went on talking, but Ryu failed to follow all the worthy man was saying. All he gathered was that the work he was engaged on ran to many great pages, and he was at almost excruciating pains to bring it to perfection. Evenings, whole weeks spent on one word, just think! Sometimes on a mere conjunction. Gran stopped abruptly and seized the doctor by a button of his coat. The words came stumbling out of an almost toothless mouth. I'd like you to understand, Doctor. I grant you it's easy enough to choose between a but and an and. It's a bit more difficult to decide between and then. But definitely, the hardest thing may be to know whether one should put an and or leave it out. Yes, Ryu said. I see your point. She started walking again. Gran looked abashed, then stepped forward and drew level. Sorry, he said awkwardly. I don't know what's come over me this evening. Ryu patted his shoulder encouragingly, saying he'd been much interested in what Grand had said and would like to help him. This seemed to reassure Grand, and when they reached his place, he suggested, after some slight hesitation, that the doctor should come in for a moment. Ryu agreed. They entered the dining room, and Grand gave him a chair beside a table strewn with sheets of paper covered with writing in a microscopic hand, crisscrossed with corrections. Yes, that's it, he said in answer to the doctor's questioning glance. But won't you drink something? I've some wine. Ryu declined. He was bending over the manuscript. No, don't look, Gran said. It's my opening phrase. It's giving trouble, no end of trouble. He too was gazing at the sheets of paper on the table, and his hand seemed irresistibly drawn to one of them. Finally, he picked it up and held it to the shadeless electric bulb so that the light shone through. The paper shook in his hand, and Ryu noticed that his forehead was moist with sweat. Sit down, he said, "and read it to me." Yes, there was timid gratitude in Gran's eyes and smile. "I think I'd like you to hear it." He gazed for a while, still gazing at the writing, then sat down. Meanwhile, Ryu was listening to the curious buzzing sound that was rising from the streets as if in answer to the soughings of the plague. At that moment, he had a preternaturally vivid awareness of the town stretched out below. A victim world secluded and apart, and of the groans of agony stifled in its darkness. Then, pitched low but clear, Gran's voice came to his ears. One fine morning in the month of May, an elegant young horsewoman might have been seating a handsome soul mere along the flowery avenues of the Bois de Boulogne. Silence returned, and with it the vague murmur of the prostrate town. Grand had put down the sheet and was still staring at it. After a while he looked up. "What do you think of it?" Ryu replied that this opening phrase had whetted his curiosity. He'd like to hear what followed. Whereat Grand told him he'd got it all wrong. He seemed excited and slapped the papers on the table with the flat of his hand. "That's only a rough draft. Once I've succeeded in rendering perfectly the picture in my mind's eye, once my words have the exact tempo of this ride, the horse is trotting, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. See what I mean? The rest will come more easily. And what's even more important, the illusion will be such that from the very first words it will be possible to say, 'Hats off!'" But before that, he admitted there was lots of hard work to be done. He'd never dream of handling that sentence to the printer in its present form, for though it sometimes satisfied him, he was fully aware that it didn't quite hit the mark as yet, and also that to some extent it had a faculty of tone approximating, remotely perhaps, but recognizably, to the commonplace. That was more or less what he was saying when they heard the sound of people running in the street below the window. Ryu stood up. "Just wait and see what I make of it," Gran said, and, glancing toward the window, added, "when all this is over." But then the sound of hurried footsteps came again. Ryu was already halfway down the stairs, and when he stepped out into the street 2 men brushed past him. They seemed to be on their way to one of the town gates. In fact, what with the heat and the plague, some of our fellow citizens were losing their heads. There had already been some scenes of violence, and nightly attempts were made to elude the sentries and escape to the outside world. Others, too, Rambert, for example, were trying to escape from this atmosphere of growing panic, but with more skill and persistence, if not with greater success. For a while, Rambert had gone on struggling with officialdom. If he was to be believed, he had always thought that perseverance would win through, inevitably, and, as he pointed out, resourcefulness in emergency was up his street, in a manner of speaking. So he plodded away, calling on all sorts of officials and others whose influence could have added weight in normal conditions. But as things were, such influence was unavailing. For the most part, they were men with well-defined and sound ideas on everything concerning exports, banking, the fruit or wine trade. Men of proved ability in handling problems related to insurance, the interpretation of ill-drawn contracts, and the like, of high qualifications and evident good intentions. That, in fact, was what struck one most, the excellence of their intentions. But as regards plague, their competence was practically nil. However, whenever opportunity arose, Rambert had tackled each of them and pleaded his cause. The gist of his argument was always the same, that he was a stranger to our town, and that being so, his case deserved special consideration. Mostly the men he talked to conceded this point readily enough, but usually they added that a good number of other people were in a like case, and thus his position was not so exceptional as he seemed to suppose. To this, Rambert could reply that this did not affect the substance of his argument in any way. He was then told that it did affect the position, already difficult, of the authorities, who were against showing any favoritism, and thus running the risk of creating what, with obvious repugnance, they called a precedent. In conversation with Dr. Ryu, Rambert classified the people whom he had approached in various categories. Those who used the arguments mentioned above he called the sticklers. Besides these, there were the consolers, who assured them that the present state of things couldn't possibly last, and when asked for definite suggestions, fobbed him off by telling him he was making too much fuss about a passing inconvenience. Then there were the very important persons who asked the visitor to leave a brief note of his cause and informed him they would decide on it in due course. The triflers, who offered him billing warrants or gave the addresses of lodgings. The red tape merchants, who made him fill up a form and properly entered it in a file. Overworked officials, who raised their arms to heaven, and much harassed officials, who simply looked away. And finally, the traditionalist, these were by far the greatest number, who referred Rambert to another office or recommended some new method of approach. These fruitless interviews had thoroughly worn out the journalist. On the credit side, he had obtained much insight into the inner workings of a municipal office and a prefect's headquarters, by dint of sitting for hours on imitation leather sofas, confronted by posters urging him to invest in saving bonds exempt from income tax, or to enlist in the colonial army, and by dint of entering offices where human faces were as blank as the filing cabinets and the dusty records of the shelves behind them. The only thing gained by all this expenditure of energy, Rambert told Ryu with a hint of bitterness, was that it served to keep his mind off his predicament. In fact, the rapid progress of the plague practically escaped his notice. Also, it made the days pass more quickly, and given the situation in which the whole town was placed, it might be said that every day lived through brought everyone, provided he survived, 24 hours nearer the end of his ordeal. Ryu could but admit the truth of his reasoning, but to his mind its truth was of rather too general an order. At one moment, Rambert had a gleam of hope. A form was sent him from the prefect's office with instructions that he was to fill in carefully all the blanks. It included questions concerning his identity, his family, his present and former sources of income. He was to give what is known as a curriculum vitae. He got an impression that inquiries were on foot with a view to drawing up a list of persons who might be instructed to leave the town and return to their homes. Some vague information gleaned from an employee in one of the offices confirmed this impression. But on going further into the matter, and finally discovering the office from which the form had emanated, he was told that this information was being collected with a view to certain contingencies. "What contingencies?" he asked. He then learned that the contingency was the possibility of him falling ill and dying of plague. The data supplied would enable the authorities to notify his family, and also to decide if the hospital expenses should be borne by the municipality, or if, in due course, they could be recovered from his relatives. On the face of it, this implied that he was not completely cut off from the woman who was awaiting his return, since the powers that be were obviously giving heed to both of them. But that was no consolation. The really remarkable thing, and Rambert was greatly struck by this, was in the way in which, in the very midst of catastrophe, offices could go on functioning serenely and take initiatives of no immediate relevance, and often unknown to the highest authority, purely and simply because they had been created originally for this purpose. The next phase was at once the easiest and the hardest for Rambert. It was a period of sheer lethargy. He had gone the round of offices, taken every step that could be taken, and realized that for all the present, all avenues of that kind were closed to him. So now he drifted aimless from cafe to cafe. In the mornings he would sit on the terrace of one of them and read a newspaper in the hope of finding some indication that the epidemic was on the wane. He would gaze at the faces of the passers-by, often turning away disgustedly from their look of unrelieved gloom. And after reading for the nth time the shop signs on the other side of the street, the advertisements of popular drinks that were no longer procurable, would rise and walk again at random in the yellow streets. Thus he killed time till nightfall, moving about the town and stopping now and then at a cafe or restaurant. One evening, Ryu noticed him hovering round the door of a cafe, unable to make his mind enter. At last he decided to go in and sat down at a table at the back of the room. It was the time when, acting under orders, cafe proprietors deferred as long as possible turning on their lights. Grey dusk was seeping into the room. The pink of sunset glowed in the wall mirrors, and the marble-topped tables glimmered white in the gathering darkness. Seated in the empty cafe, Rambert looked pathetically lost, a mere shade among the shadows, and Ryu guessed that this was the hour when he felt most derelict. It was, indeed, the hour of day when all the prisoners of the town realized their dereliction, and each was thinking that something, no matter what, must be done to hasten their deliverance. Ryu turned hurriedly away. Rambert also spent a certain amount of time at the railroad station. No one was allowed on the platforms, but the waiting rooms, which could be entered from outside, remained open, and being cool and dark, were often patronized by beggars on very hot days. Rambert spent much time studying the timetables, reading the prohibitions against spitting, and the passengers' regulations. After that he sat down in a corner. An old cast-iron stove, which had been stone-cold for months, rose like a sort of landmark in the middle of the room, surrounded by figure-of-8 patterns on the floor, the traceries of long-past sprinklings. Posters on the walls gaily invited tourists to a carefree holiday at Cannes or Bandol. And in his corner Rambert savored that bitter sense of freedom which comes of total deprivation. The evocations which at the time he found most poignant were, anyhow according to what he told Ryu, those of Paris. There rose before his eyes, unsummoned, vistas of old stones and riverbanks, the pigeons of the Palais Royal, the Gare du Nord, quiet old streets round the Pantheon, and many another scene of the city he'd never known he loved so much. And these mental pictures killed any desire for any form of action. And when one day Rambert told him that he liked waking up at 4 in the morning and thinking of his beloved Paris, the doctor guessed easily enough, basing this on his own experience, that that was his favorite time for conjuring up pictures of the woman with whom he was now parted. This was, indeed, the hour when he could feel surest she was wholly his. Till 4 in the morning one is seldom doing anything, and at that hour, even if the night has been a night of betrayal, one is asleep. Yes, everyone sleeps at that hour, and this is reassuring, since the great longing of an unquiet heart is to possess constantly and consciously the loved one, or, failing that, to be able to plunge the loved one, when a time of absence intervenes, into a dreamless sleep timed to last unbroken into the day they meet again. Shortly after Father Penelot's sermon, the hot weather set in with a vengeance. On the day following the unseasonable downpour of that Sunday, summer blazed out above the housetops. First a strong, scorching wind blew steadily for a whole day, drying up the walls. And then the sun took charge. Incessant waves of heat and light swept the town day long, and but for arcaded streets and the interiors of houses, everything lay naked to the dazzling impact of the light. The sun stalked our townsfolk along every byway, into every nook, and when they paused, it struck. Since this first onslaught of the heat synchronized with the startling increase in the number of victims, there was now nearly 700 deaths a week. A mood of profound discouragement settled on the town. In the suburbs, little was left of the wonted animation between the long, flat streets and the terraced houses. Ordinary people living in these districts used to spend the best part of their day on their doorsteps, but now every door was shut, nobody was to be seen, even the Ventian blinds stayed down, and there was no knowing whether it was the heat or the plague that they were trying to shut out. In some houses groans could be heard. At first, when that happened, people often gathered outside and listened, prompted by curiosity or compassion. But under the prolonged strain, it seemed that hearts had toughened. People lived beside these groans or walked past them as though they had become the normal speech of men. As a result of the fighting at the gates, in the course of which the police had had to use their revolvers, a spirit of lawlessness was abroad. Some had certainly been wounded in the brushes with the police, but in the town, where owing to the combined influences of heat and terror, everything was exaggerated, there was talk of deaths. One thing, anyhow, was certain. Discontent was on the increase, and fearing worse to come, the local officials debated lengthily on the measures to be taken if the populace, goaded to frenzy by the epidemic, got completely out of hand. The newspapers published new regulations reiterating the orders against attempting to leave the town, and warning those who infringed them that they were liable to long terms of imprisonment. A system of patrols was instituted, and often in the empty, sweltering streets, heralded by a clatter of horse hooves on the cobbles, a detachment of mounted police would make its way between the parallel lines of close-shut windows. Now and again a gunshot was heard. The special brigade recently detailed to destroy cats and dogs, as possible carriers of an infection, was at work. and these whip-crack sounds startling the silence increased the nervous tension already existing in the town. For in the heat and stillness, and for the troubled hearts of our townsfolk, anything, even the least sound, had a heightened significance. The varying aspect of the sky, the very smells rising from the soil that mark each change of season, were taken notice of for the first time. Everyone realized with dismay that hot weather would favor the epidemic, and it was clear that summer was settling in. The cries of swifts in the evening air above the housetops was growing shriller, and the sky, too, had lost the spaciousness of those June twilights when our horizon seemed infinitely remote. In the markets, the flowers no longer came in buds, they were already in full bloom, and after the morning's marketing, the dusty pavements were littered with trampled petals. It was plain to see that spring had spent itself, lavished its ardor in the myriads of flowers that were bursting everywhere into bloom, and now was being crushed out by the twofold onslaught of heat and plague. For our fellow citizens, that summer sky, and the streets thick in dust, gray as their present lives, had the same ominous import as the 100 deaths now weighing daily on the town. That incessant sunlight, and those bright hours associated with siesta, or with holidays, no longer invited, as in the past, to frolics and flirtation on the beaches. Now they rang hollow in the silence of the closed town. They had lost the golden spell of happier summers. Plague had killed all colors, vetoed pleasure. That, indeed, was one of the great changes brought by the epidemic. Hitherto, all of us welcomed summer in with pleasant anticipation. The town was open to the sea, and its young folk made free of the beaches. But this summer, for all its nearness, the sky was out of bounds. Young limbs had no longer the run of its delights. What could we do under these conditions? It is Thoreau again who paints the most faithful picture of our life in those days. Needless to say, he outlined the progress of the plague, and he, too, notes that a new phase of the epidemic was ushered in when the radio announced no longer weekly totals, but 92, 107, and 130 deaths in a day. The newspapers and the authorities are playing ball with the plague. They fancy they're scoring off it because 130 is a smaller figure than 910. He also records such striking or moving incidents of the epidemic as came under his notice, that for instance, of the woman in a lonely street who abruptly opened a shuttered window just above her head and gave 2 loud shrieks before closing the shutters again on the dark interior of a bedroom. But he also noted that peppermint lozenges had vanished from the drugstores, because there was a popular belief that when sucking them, you were proof against contagion. He went on watching his pet specimen on the opposite balcony. It seemed that tragedy had come to the ancient small-game hunter as well. One moment there had been gunshots in the street, and as Thoreau put it, some gobs of lead had killed off most of the cats and scared away the others. Anyhow, they were no longer about. That day the little old man went on to his balcony at the usual hour, showed some surprise, and, leaning on the rail, closely scanned the corners of the street. Then he settled down to wait, fretfully tapping the balustrade with his right hand. After staying there for some time, he tore up a few sheets of paper, went back into his room, and came out again. After another longish wait, he retreated again into the room, slamming the French windows behind him. He followed the same procedure daily during the rest of the week, and the sadness and bewilderment on the old face deepened as the days went by. On the 8th day, Thoreau waited in vain for his appearance. The window stayed resolutely closed on all too comprehensible distress. This entry ends with Thoreau summing up, "It is forbidden to spit on cats in plague time." In another context, Thoreau notes that, on coming home in the evenings, he invariably saw the night watchman pacing the hall, like a sentry on his beat. The man never failed to remind everyone he met that he'd foreseen what was happening. Thoreau agreed that he'd predicted a disaster, but reminded him that the event predicted by him was an earthquake. To which the old fellow replied, "If only it had been an earthquake. A good bad shock and there you are. You count the dead and living and that's an end of it. But this here damned disease, even them who haven't got it can't think of anything else." The manager of the hotel was equally downhearted. In the early days, travelers, unable to leave the town, had kept on their rooms. But one by one, seeing that the epidemic showed no sign of abating, they moved out to stay with friends. And the same cause that had led to all the rooms being occupied now kept them empty, since there were no newcomers to the town. Tarot was one of the few remaining guests, and the manager never lost an opportunity of informing him that, were he not reluctant to put the gentleman to inconvenience, he would have closed the hotel long ago. He often asked Tarot to say how long he thought the epidemic would last. "They say," Tarot informed him, "that cold weather stamps out diseases of this type." The manager looked aghast. "But my dear sir, it's never really cold in these parts. And anyhow, that would mean it's going to last many months more." Moreover, he was sure that for a long while to come, travelers would give the town a wide berth. This epidemic spelt the ruin of the tourist trade, in fact. After a short absence, M. Othen, the owlish paterfamilias, made a reappearance in the restaurant, but accompanied only by the two preforming poodles, his offspring. On inquiry, it came out that Mrs. Othen was in quarantine. She had been nursing her mother, who was succumbed to plague. "I don't like it a bit," the manager told Tarot. "Quarantine or not, she's under suspicion, which means that they are too." Tarot pointed out that, if it came to that, everyone was under suspicion. But the manager had his own ideas, and was not to be shaken out of them. "No, sir, you and I were not under suspicion, but they certainly are." However, M. Othen was impervious to such considerations, and would not let the plague change his habits. He entered the restaurant with his wonted dignity, sat down in front of his children, and addressed to them at intervals the same nicely worded, unamiable remarks. Only the small boy looked somewhat different, dressed in black like his sister. A little more shrunken than before, he now seemed a miniature replica of his father. The night watchman, who had no liking for M. Othen, had said of him to Tarot, "That fine gentleman will pass out with his clothes on, all nicely dressed up and ready to go, so I won't need no laying out." Tarot has some comments on the sermon preached by Penelot. "I can understand that type of fervor and find it's not displeasing. At the beginning of a pestilence and when it ends, there's always a prosperity for rhetoric. In the first case, habits have not yet been lost. In the second, they're returning. It is in the thick of a calamity that one gets hardened to the truth. In other words, to silence. So, let's wait." Tarot also records that he had a long walk with Dr. Ryu. All he remembered was that it had good results. In this connection, he notes the color of Mrs. Ryu's, the doctor's mother's, eyes, a limpid brown, and makes the odd observation that a gaze relieving so much goodness of heart would always triumph over plague. He also has a good deal to say about Ryu's asthma patient. He went with the doctor to see him, immediately after their conversation. The old man greeted Tarot with a chuckle, and rubbed his hands cheerfully. He was sitting up in bed, with the usual 2 pans of dried peas in front of him. "Ah, here's another of 'em," he exclaimed when he saw Tarot. "It's a topsy-turvy world, all right. More doctors than patients, because it's mowing them down, ain't it? More and more. That priest's right. We were asking for it." Next day, Tarot came to see him without warning. From Tarot's notes, we gather that the old man, a dry goods dealer by occupation, decided at the age of 50 that he'd done enough work for a lifetime. He took to his bed and never left it again, but not because of his asthma, which would not have prevented his getting about. A small fixed income had seen him through to his present age, 75, and the years had not damped his cheerfulness. He couldn't bear the sight of a watch, and indeed there wasn't one in the whole house. "Watches," he said, "are silly gadgets, and dear at that." He worked out the time, that is to say, the time for meals, with his 2 saucepans, one of which was always full of peas when he woke in the morning. He filled the other, pea by pea, at a constant, carefully regulated speed. Thus, time for him was reckoned by these pans, and he could take his bearings in it at any moment of the day. "Every 15 pans," he said. "It's feeding time. What could be simpler?" If his wife was to be trusted, he had given signs of his vocation at a very early age. Nothing, in fact, had ever interested him. His work, friendships, cafes, music, women, outings, to all he was indifferent. He He had never left his hometown except once when he had been called to Algiers for family affairs, and even then he had alighted from the train at the first station after Oran, incapable of continuing the adventure. He took the first train back. To Tarot, who had shown surprise at the secluded life he led, he had given the following explanation, more or less. According to religion, the first half of a man's life is an upgrade, the second goes downhill. On the descending days he has no claim, they may be snatched from him at any moment, thus he can do nothing with them, and the best thing, precisely, is to do nothing with them. He obviously has no compunction about contradicting himself, for a few minutes later he told Tarot that God did not exist, since otherwise there would be no need for priests. But from some observations which followed, Tarot realized that the old fellow's philosophy was closely involved with the irritation caused by the house-to-house collection in aid of charities, which took place almost incessantly in that part of the town. What completed the picture of the old man was a desire he expressed several times, and which seemed deeply rooted, the desire to die at a very advanced age. "Is he a saint?" Tarot asked himself, and answered, "Yes, if saintliness is an aggregate of habits." Meanwhile, Tarot was compiling a longish description of a day in the plague-stricken town. It was to give a full and accurate picture of the life of our fellow citizens during that summer. "Nobody laughs," Tarot observes, "except the drunk, and they laugh too much." After which he embarks on his description. "At daybreak, light breaths of air fan the still empty streets. At this hour, between the night victims and the death agonies of the following day, it is as if for a while plague stays its hand and takes breath. All shops are shut, but on some a notice, closed owing to plague, shows that when the others open presently, these will not. Still half asleep, the newsboys not yet cry the news, but, lounging at street corners, offer their ways to the lamp-posts, with the vague gestures of sleepwalkers. Soon, awakened by the early streetcars, they will fan out through the town, holding at arm's length sheets on which the word plague looms large. Will there be a plague autumn? Professor B says no. Toll of the 94th day of plague, 124 deaths. In spite of the growing shortage of paper, which has compelled some dailies to reduce their pages, a new paper has been launched, the Plague Chronicle. It sets out to inform our townspeople with scrupulous veracity of the daily progress or recession of the disease, to supply them with the most authoritative opinions available as if to its future course, to offer the hospitality of its columns to all, in whatever walk of life, who wish to join in combating the epidemic, to keep up the morale of the populace, to publish the latest orders issued by the authorities, and to centralize the efforts of all who desire to give active and wholehearted help in the present emergency. Actually, this newspaper very soon came to devote its columns to advertisements of the new, infallible antidotes against plague. Toward 6 in the morning, all these papers are being sold to the lines that begin to form outside of the shops, over an hour before they open, then to the passengers alighting from a streetcars coming in, packed to capacity, from the suburbs. The cars are now the only means of transport, and they have much difficulty in progressing, what with people standing on the running boards and hanging in clusters from the handrails. A queer thing is how the passengers all try to keep their backs turned to their neighbors, twisting themselves into grotesque attitudes in the attempt, the idea being, of course, to avoid contagion. At every stop a cataract of men and women is disgorged, each in haste to put a safe distance between himself or herself and the rest. When the first streetcars have gone by, the town gradually wakes up. Early cafes open their doors, and you see an array of cards on the counter. No coffee, bring your own sugar, and the like. Next, the shops open and the streets grow livelier. And meanwhile, the light is swelling in the sky, even at this early hour, beginning to grow leaden-hued with heat. This is the time when those who have nothing to do venture out on the boulevards. Most of them seem determined to counteract the plague by a lavish display of luxury. Daily, about 7, you see a sort of dress parade of youths and girls, who make you realize the frantic desire for life that thrives in the heart of every great calamity. If the epidemic spreads, morals too will broaden. And we may see again the Saturnalia of Milan, men and women dancing round the graves. At noon, in a flash, all the restaurants fill up. Very quickly, small groups of people unable to find a seat form at the doors. Because of the intense heat, the sky is losing its brightness. Under big awnings, the aspirants to food await their turn, alighted along the curbs of streets gaping and sizzling in the fires of noon. The reason for the restaurants being so crowded is that they solve for many the feeding problem, but they do nothing to allay the fear of contagion. Many of the customers spend several minutes methodically wiping their plates. Not so long ago, some restaurants put up notices. Are plates, knives, and forks guaranteed sterilized? But gradually, they discontinued publicity of this order, since their customers came in any case. People, moreover, spend very freely. Choice wines, or wines alleged to be such, the costliest extras. A mood of freckless extravagance is settling in. It seems that there was something like a panic in a restaurant because a customer suddenly felt ill, went very wide, and staggered precipitately to the door. Toward 2 o'clock, the town slowly empties. It is the time when silence, sunlight, dusk, and plague have the streets to themselves. Wave after wave of heat flows over the frontage of the tall grey houses during these long, languid hours. Thus the afternoon wears on, slowly merging into an evening that settles down like a red winding sheet on the serried tumult of the town. At the start of the great heat, for some unascertained reason, the evenings found the street almost empty. But now the last ripple of cooler air brings an easing of the strain, if not a flutter of hope. Then all stream out into the open, drug themselves with talking, start arguing or love-making, and in the last glow of sunset the town, freighted with lovers 2 by 2 and loud with voices, drift like a helmless ship into the throbbing darkness. In vain a zealous evangelist with a felt hat and flowing tie threads his way through the crowd, crying without cease, "God is great and good, come unto him." On the contrary, they all make haste towards some trivial objective that seems of more immediate interest than God. In the early days, when they thought this epidemic was much like other epidemics, religion held its ground. But once these people realized their instant peril, they gave their thoughts to pleasure. And all the hideous fears that stamp their faces in the daytime are transformed in the fiery, dusty nightfall into a sort of hectic exhalation, an unkept freedom fevering their blood. And I, too, I am no different. But what matter? Death means nothing to men like me. It's the event that proves them right. It was Tarot who had asked Ryu for the interviews he refers to in his diary. On that evening, as it happened, just before Tarot arrived, the doctor had gazed for some moments at his mother, who was sitting very still in a corner of the dining room. Once her household tasks were over, she spent most of her time in that chair. Her hands folded in her lap, she sat there, waiting. Ryu wasn't even sure it was for him she waited. However, something always changed in his mother's face when he came in. The silent resignation that a laborious life had given it seemed to light up with a sudden glow. Then she returned to her tranquility. That evening, she was gazing out of the window at a now empty street. The street lighting had been reduced by 2/3, and only at long intervals a lamp cast flickering gleams through the thick darkness of the town. "Will they keep to the reduced lighting as long as the plague lasts?" Mrs. Ryu asked. "I expect so." "Let's hope it doesn't last till winter. It would be terribly depressing." "Yes," Ryu said. He saw his mother's gaze settle on his forehead. He knew that the worry and overwork of the last few days had scorched their traces there. "Didn't things go well today?" his mother asked. "Oh, much as usual." As usual. That was to say, the new consignment of serum sent from Paris seemed less effective than the first, and the death rate was rising. It was still impossible to administer prophylactic inoculations elsewhere than in families already attacked. If its use was to be generalized, very large quantities of the vaccine would have been needed. Most of the buboes refused to burst. It was as if they underwent a seasonal hardening, and the victims suffered horribly. During the last 24 hours, there had been 2 cases of a new form of the epidemic. The plague was becoming pneumonic. On this very day, in the course of a meeting, the much-harassed doctors had pressed the prefect. The unfortunate man seemed quite to his wits' end, to issue new regulations to prevent contagion from being carried from mouth to mouth, as happens in pneumonic plague. The prefect had done as they wished, but as usual they were groping, more or less, in the dark. Looking at his mother, he felt an uprush of a half-forgotten emotion, the love of his boyhood, at the sight of her long brown gaze intent on him. "Don't you ever feel alarmed, Mother?" "Oh, at my age there isn't much left to fear." "The days are very long, and just now I'm hardly ever at home." "I don't mind waiting, if I know you're going to come back. And when you aren't here, I think of what you're doing. Have you any news?" "Yes, if I'm to believe the last telegram, everything's going as well as could be expected. But I know she says that to prevent my worrying." The doorbell rang. The doctor gave his mother a smile and went to open the door. In the dim light of the landing, Tarot looked like a big gray bear. Ryu gave his visitor a seat facing his desk, while he himself remained standing behind the desk chair. Between them was the only light in the room, a desk lamp. Tarot came straight to the point. "I know," he said, "that I can talk to you quite frankly." Ryu nodded. "In a fortnight, or a month at most," Tarot continued, "you'll serve no purpose here. Things will have got out of hand." "I agree. The sanitary department is inefficient, understaffed, for one thing, and you're worked off your feet." Ryu admitted this was so. "Well," Tarot said, "I've heard that the authorities are thinking of a sort in conscription of the population, and all men in good health would be required to help in fighting the plague." "Your information was correct. But the authorities are in none too good odor as it is, and the prefect can't make up his mind." "If he daren't risk compulsion, why not call for voluntary help?" "It's been done. The response was poor." "It was done through official channels, and half-heartedly. What they're short on is imagination. Officialdom can never cope with something really catastrophic, and the remedial measures they think up are hardly adequate for a common cold. If we let them carry on like this, they'll soon be dead, and so shall we." "That's more than likely," Ryu said. "I should tell you, however, that they're thinking of using the prisoners in the jail for what we call the heavy work." "I'd rather free men were employed." "So would I. But might I ask why you feel like that?" "I loathe men's being condemned to death." Ryu looked Tarot in the eyes. "So what?" he said. "It's this I have to say. I've drawn up a plan for voluntary groups of helpers. Get me empowered to try out my plan, and then let's sidetrack officialdom. In any case, the authorities have their hands more than full already. I have friends in many walks of life. They'll form a nucleus to start from. And, of course, I'll take part in it myself." "I need hardly to tell you," Ryu replied, "that I accept your suggestion most gladly. One can't have too many helpers, especially in a job like mine under present conditions. I undertake to get your plan approved by the authorities. Anyhow, they've no choice. But," Ryu pondered, "but I take it you know that work of this kind may prove fatal to the worker. And I feel I should ask you this. Have you weighed the dangers?" Tarot's gray eyes met the doctor's gaze serenely. "What do you think of Penelow's sermon, Doctor?" The question was asked in a quite ordinary tone, and Ryu answered in the same tone. "I've seen too much of hospitals to relish any idea of collective punishment. But as you know, Christians sometimes say that sort of thing without really thinking it. They're better than they seem." "However, you think, like Penelope, that the plague has its good side. It opens men's eyes and forces them to take thought?" The doctor tossed his head impatiently. "So does every ill that flesh is heir to. What's true of all the evils in the world is true of plague as well. It helps men to rise above themselves. All the same, when you see the misery it brings, You need to be a madman or a coward or stone blind to give in tamely to the plague. Taro had hardly raised his voice at all, but Taro made a slight gesture as if to calm him. He was smiling. Yes, Ryu shrugged his shoulders. But you haven't answered my question yet. Have you weighed the consequences? Taro squared his shoulders against the back of the chair, then moved his head forward into the light. Do you believe in God, Doctor? Again the question was put in an ordinary tone, but this time Ryu took longer to find his answer. No, but what does that really mean? I'm fumbling in the dark, struggling to make something out, but I have long ceased finding that original. Isn't that it? The gulf between Penelo and you? I doubt it. Penelo is a man of learning, a scholar. He hasn't come in contact with death. That's why he can speak with such assurance of the truth with a capital T. But every country priest who visits his parishioners and has learned of man gasping for breath on his deathbed thinks as I do. He tried to relieve human suffering before trying to point out its excellence. Ryu stood up. His face was now in shadow. Let's drop this subject, he said, as you won't answer. Taro remained seated in his chair. He was smiling again. Suppose I answer with a question. The doctor now smiled too. You like being mysterious, don't you? Yes, fire away. My question's this, said Taro. Why do you yourself show such devotion, considering you don't believe in God? I suspect your answer may help me to mine. His face still in shadow. Ryu said that he'd already answered, that if he believed in an all-powerful God, he would cease curing the sick and leave that to him. But no one in the world believed in a God of that sort. No, not even Penelo, who believed that he believed in such a God. And this was proven by the fact that no one ever threw himself on Providence completely. Anyhow, in this respect, Ryu believed himself to be on the right road, in fighting against creation as he found it. Ah, Taro remarked. So that's the idea you have of your profession. More or less. The doctor came back into the light. Taro made a faint whistling noise with his lips, and the doctor gazed at him. Yes, you're thinking it calls for pride to feel that way. But I assure you I've no more than the pride that's needed to keep me going. I have no idea what's awaiting me, or what will happen when all this ends. For the moment, I know this. There are sick people and they need curing. Later on, perhaps, they'll think things over, and so shall I. But what's wanted now is to make them feel well. I defend them as best I can, that's all. Against whom? Ryu turned to the window. A shadow line on the horizon told of the presence of the sea. He was conscious only of his exhaustion, and at the same time was struggling against a sudden, irrational impulse to unburden himself a little more than his companion. An eccentric, perhaps, but who, he guessed, was one of his own kind. I haven't a notion, Taro. I assure you I haven't a notion. When I entered this profession, I did it abstractly, so to speak, because I had a desire for it, because it meant a career like another, one that young men often aspire to. Perhaps, too, because it was particularly difficult for a workman's son, like myself. And then I had to see people die. Do you know that there are some who refuse to die? Have you ever heard a woman scream never with her last gasp? Well, I have. And then I saw that I could never get hardened to it. I was young then, and I was outraged by the whole scheme of things. Or so I thought. Subsequently, I grew more modest. Only I've never managed to get used to seeing people die. That's all I know. Yet after all... Ryu fell silent and sat down. He felt his mouth dry. After all? Ryu prompted softly. After all... The doctor repeated, then hesitated again, fixing his eyes on Taro. It's something that a man of your sort can understand most likely. But, since the order of the world is shaped by death, might it be better for God if we refuse to believe in him, and struggle with all our might against death? without raising our eyes toward the heaven where he sits in silence. Thoreau nodded. Yes, but your victories will never be lasting, that's all. Ryu's face hardened. Yes, I know that, but it's no reason for giving up the struggle. No reason, I agree. Only, I now can picture what this plague must mean for you. Yes, a never-ending defeat. Thoreau stared at the doctor for a moment, then turned and trampled heavily toward the door. Ryu followed him and was almost at his side when Thoreau, who was staring at the floor, suddenly said, Who taught you all this, doctor? The reply came promptly, Suffering. Ryu opened the door of his surgery and told Thoreau that he, too, was going out. He had a patient to visit in the suburbs. Thoreau suggested they should go together, and he agreed. In the hall they encountered Mrs. Ryu, and the doctor introduced Thoreau to her. A friend of mine, he said. Indeed, said Mrs. Ryu. I'm very pleased to make your acquaintance. When she left them, Thoreau turned to gaze after her. On the landing, the doctor pressed a switch to turn on the lights along the stairs. But the stairs remained in darkness. Possibly some new light-saving order had come into force. Really, however, there was no knowing. For some time past, in the streets, no less than in private houses, everything had been going out of order. It might be only that the concierge, like nearly everyone in the town, was ceasing to bother about his duties. The doctor had no time to follow up his thoughts. Thoreau's voice came from behind him. Just one word more, doctor, even if it sounds to you a bit nonsensical. You are perfectly right. The doctor merely gave a little shrug, unseen in the darkness. To tell the truth, all that's outside my range. But you, what do you know about it? Ah, Thoreau replied quite coolly. I've little left to learn. Ryu paused, and behind him, Thoreau's foot slipped on a step. He steadied himself by gripping the doctor's shoulder. Do you really imagine you know everything about life? The answer came through the darkness in the same confident tone. Yes. Once in the street, they realized it must be quite late, 11 perhaps. All was silent in the town, except for some vague rustlings. An ambulance bell clanged faintly in the distance. They stepped into the car, and Ryu started the engine. You must come to the hospital tomorrow, he said, for an injection. But before embarking on this adventure, you'd better know your chances of coming out of it alive. They're 1 in 3. That sort of reckoning doesn't hold water. You know it, Doctor, as well as I. 100 years ago, plague wiped out the entire population of a town in Persia, with one exception, and the sole survivor was precisely the man whose job it was to wash the dead bodies, and who carried on throughout the epidemic. He pulled off his 1 in 3 chance, that's all. Ryu had lowered his voice. But you're right. We know next to nothing on the subject. They were entering the suburbs. The headlights lit up empty streets. The car stopped. Standing in front of it, Ryu asked Thoreau if he'd like to come in. Thoreau said, Yes. A glimmer of light from the sky lit up their faces. Suddenly, Ryu gave a short laugh, and there was much friendliness in it. Out with it, Thoreau. What on earth prompted you to take a hand in this? I don't know. My code of morals, perhaps. Your code of morals? What code? Comprehension. Thoreau turned toward the house, and Ryu did not see his face again until they were in the old asthma patient's room. Next day, Thoreau set to work and enrolled a first team of workers, soon to be followed by many others. However, it is not the narrator's intention to ascribe to these sanitary groups more importance than their due. Doubtless today many of our fellow citizens are apt to yield to the temptation of exaggerating the services they rendered. But the narrator is inclined to think that by attributing over-importance to praiseworthy actions, one may, by implication, be paying indirect but potent homage to the worst side of human nature. For this attitude implies that such actions shine out as rare exceptions, while callousness and apathy are the general rule. The narrator does not share that view. The evil that is in the world always comes of ignorance, and good intentions may do as much harm as malevolence, if they lack understanding. On the whole, men are more good than bad. That, however, isn't the real point. But they are more or less ignorant, and it is this that we call vice or virtue. The most incorrigible vice being that of an ignorance that fancies it knows everything and therefore claims for itself the right to kill. The soul of the murderer is blind, and there can be no true goodness nor true love without the utmost clear-sightedness. Hence the sanitary groups, whose creation was entirely Thoreau's work, should be considered with objectivity as well as with approval. And this is why the narrator declines to vaunt in overglowing terms of courage, and a devotion to which he attributes only a relative and reasonable importance. But he will continue being the chronicler of the troubled, rebellious hearts of the townspeople under the impact of the plague. Those who enrolled in the sanitary squads, as they were called, had indeed no such great merit in doing as they did, since they knew it was the only thing to do, and the unthinkable thing would then have been not to have brought themselves to do it. These groups enabled our townsfolk to come to grips with the disease, and convince them that, now that plague was among us, it was up to them to do whatever could be done to fight it. Since plague became in this way some men's duty, it revealed itself what it really was, that is, the concern of all. So far so good, but we do not congratulate a schoolmaster on teaching that 2 and 2 make 4. Though we may, perhaps, congratulate him on having chosen his laudable vocation. Let us then say it was praiseworthy that Thoreau and so many others should have elected to prove that 2 and 2 make 4, rather than the contrary. But let us add that this good will of theirs was one that is shared by the schoolmaster, and by all who have the same feelings as the schoolmaster. And, be it said to the credit of mankind, they are more numerous than one would think. Such, anyhow, is the narrator's conviction. Needless to say, he can see quite clearly a point that could be made against him, which is that these men were risking their lives. But again and again there comes a time in history when the man who dares to say that 2 and 2 make 4 is punished with death. The schoolteacher is well aware of this, and the question is not one of knowing what punishment or reward attends the making of this calculation. The question is that of knowing whether 2 and 2 do make 4. For those of our townsfolk who risked their lives in this predicament, the issue was whether or not plague was in their midst, and whether or not they must fight against it. Many fledgling moralists in those days were going about our town proclaiming there was nothing to be done about it and we should bow to the inevitable. And Thoreau, Rieu, and their friends might give one answer or another, but its conclusion was always the same, their certitude that a fight must be put up, in this way or that, and there must be no bowing down. The essential thing was to save the greatest possible number of persons from dying and being doomed to unending separation. And to do this, there was only one resource: to fight the plague. There was nothing admirable about this attitude. It was merely logical. Thus, it was only natural that old Dr. Castell should plod away with unshaken confidence, never sparing himself, at making anti-plague serum on the spot with the makeshift equipment at his disposal. Rieu shared his hope that a vaccine made with cultures of the bacilli obtained locally would take effect more actively than serum coming from outside, since the local bacillus differed slightly from the normal plague bacillus as defined in textbooks of tropical diseases. And Castell expected to have his first supply ready within a surprisingly short period. That, too, is why it was natural that Grand, who had nothing of the hero about him, should now be acting as a sort of general secretary to the sanitary squads. A certain number of the groups organized by Thoreau were working in the congested areas of the town, with a view of improving the sanitary conditions there. Their duties were to see that houses were kept in a proper hygienic state and to list attics and cellars that had not been disinfected by the official sanitary service. Other teams of volunteers accompanied the doctors on their house-to-house visits, saw to the evacuation of infected persons, and subsequently, owing to the shortage of drivers, even drove the vehicles conveying sick persons and dead bodies. All this involved the upkeep of registers and statistics, and Grant undertook that task. From this angle, the narrator holds that, more than Ryu or Taro, Grant was the true embodiment of the quiet courage that inspired the sanitary groups. He had said yes without a moment's hesitation and with a large-heartedness that was a second nature to him. All he had asked was to be allotted light duties. He was too old for anything else. He would give his time from 6 to 8 every evening. When Ryu thanked him with some warmth, he seemed surprised. "Why, that's not difficult. Plague is here, and we've got to make a stand. It's obvious. I only wish everything was simple." And he went back to his phrase. Sometimes in the evening, when he had filed his reports and worked out his statistics, Grant and Ryu would have a chat. Soon they formed the habit of including Taro in their talks, and Grant unburdened himself with the increasingly apparent pleasure to his two companions. They began to take a genuine interest in the laborious literary task to which he was applying himself while plague raged around him. Indeed, they too found in it a relaxation of the strain. "How's your young lady on horseback progressing?" Taro would ask. And invariably, Grant would answer with a wry smile. "Trotting along, trotting along." One evening, Grant announced that he had definitely discarded the adjective elegant for his horsewoman. From now on, it was replaced by slim. "That's more concrete," he explained. Soon after, he read out to his two friends the new version of the sentence. "One fine morning in May, a slim young horsewoman might have been seen riding a handsome sorrel mare along the flowery avenues of the Bois de Boulogne. Don't you agree with me one sees her better that way? And I've put one fine morning in May, because in the month of May tended rather to drag out the trot, if you see what I mean." Next, he showed some anxiety about the adjective handsome. In his opinion, it didn't convey enough, and he set to looking for an epithet that would promptly and clearly photograph the superb animal he saw with his mind's eye. Plump wouldn't do. Though concrete enough, it sounded perhaps a little disparaging, also a shade vulgar. Beautifully groomed had tempted him for a moment, but it was cumbrous and made the rhythm limp somewhat. Then one evening, he announced triumphantly that he had got it. "A black sorrel mare." To his thinking, he explained, black conveyed a hint of elegance and opulence. "It won't do," Ryu said. "Why not?" "Because sorrel doesn't mean a breed of horse. It's a color." "What color?" "Well, a color that, anyhow, isn't black." Grant seemed greatly troubled. "Thank you," he said warmly. "How fortunate you're here to help me. But you see how difficult it is." "How about glossy?" Taro suggested. Grant gazed at him meditatively. Then, "Yes," he exclaimed. "That's good." And slowly his lips parted in a smile. Some days later, he confessed that the word flowery was bothering him considerably. As the only towns he knew were Oran and Montélimar, he sometimes asked his friends to tell him about the avenues of the Bois de Boulogne, what sort of flowers grew in them, and how they were disposed. Actually, neither Ryu nor Taro had ever gathered the impression that those avenues were flowery, but Grant's conviction on the subject shook their confidence in their memories. He was amazed at their uncertainty. "It's only artists who know how to use their eyes," was his conclusion. But one evening, the doctor found him in a state of much excitement. For flowery, he had substituted flower-strewn. He was rubbing his hands. "At last, one can see them, smell them. Hats off, gentlemen!" Triumphantly, he read out the sentence. "One fine morning in May, a slim young horsewoman might have been seen riding a glossy sorrel mare along the flower-strewn avenues of the Bois de Boulogne." But, spoken aloud, the numerous S sounds had a disagreeable effect, and Grant stumbled over them, lisping here and there. He sat down, crestfallen. Then he asked the doctor if he might go. Some hard thinking lay ahead of him. It was about this time, as was subsequently learned, that he began to display signs of absent-mindedness in the office. A serious view was taken of these lapses of attention, as the municipality not only was working at high pressure with a reduced staff, but was constantly having new duties thrust upon it. His department suffered, and his chief took him severely to task, pointing out that he was paid to do certain work and was failing to do it as it should be done. "I am told that you are acting as a voluntary helper in the sanitary groups. You do this out of office hours, so it's no concern of mine. But the best way of making yourself useful in a terrible time like this is to do your work well. Otherwise, the rest is useless." "He's right," Gren said to Ryu. "Yes, he's right," the doctor agreed. "But I can't steady my thoughts. It's the end of my phrase that's worrying me. I don't seem able to sort it out." The plethora of sibilants in the sentence still offended his ear, but he saw no way of amending them without using what were, to his mind, inferior synonyms. And that flower strewn which had rejoiced him when he first lit on it now seemed unsatisfactory. How could one say the flowers were strewn when presumably they had been planted along the avenues, or else grew there naturally? On some evenings, indeed, he looked more tired than Ryu. Yes, this unavailing quest which had never left his mind had worn him out. Nonetheless, he went on adding up the figures and compiling the statistics needed for the sanitary groups. Patiently, every evening he brought his totals up to date, illustrated them with graphs, and racked his brain to present the data in the most exact, clearest form. Quite often, he went to see Ryu at one of the hospitals and asked to be given a table in an office or the dispensary. He would settle down at it with his papers, exactly as he settled down at his desk in the municipal office, and wave each completed sheet to dry the ink in the warm air, noisome with disinfectants and the disease itself. At these times, he made honest efforts not to think about his horsewoman and concentrate on what he had to do. Yes, if it is a fact that people like to have examples given them, men of the type they call heroic, and if it is absolutely necessary that this narrative should include a hero, the narrator commends to his readers, which to his thinking perfect justice, this insignificant and obscure hero who had to his credit only a little goodness of heart and a seemingly absurd ideal. This will render to the truth its due, to the addition of 2 and 2 its sum of 4, and to heroism the secondary place that rightly falls to it, just after, never before, the noble claim of happiness. It will also give this chronicle its character, which is intended to be that of a narrative made with good feelings. That is to say, feelings that are neither demonstrably bad nor overcharged with emotion in the ugly manner of a stage play. Such at least was Dr. Ryu's opinion when he read in newspapers or heard in the radio the messages and encouragement the outer world transmitted to the plague-ridden populace. Besides the comforts sent by air or overland, compassionate or admiring comments were lavished on the henceforth isolated town, by way of newspaper articles or broadcast talks. And invariably, their epical or prize speech verbiage jarred on the doctor. Needless to say, he knew the sympathy was genuine enough, but it could be expressed only in the conventional language in which men try to express what unites them in mankind in general. A vocabulary quite unsuited, for example, to Gran's small daily effort, and incapable of describing what Gran stood for under plague conditions. Sometimes at midnight, in the great silence of the sleep-bound town, the doctor turned on his radio before going to bed for the last few hours' sleep he allowed himself. And from the ends of the earth, across thousands of miles of land and sea, kindly, well-meaning speakers tried to voice their fellow feeling, and indeed did so, but at the same time proved the utter incapacity of every man truly to share in suffering that he cannot see. "Aran! Aran!" In vain the call rang over oceans. In vain Ryu listened hopefully. Always the tide of eloquence began to flow, bringing home still more the unbridgeable gulf that lay between Grand and the speaker. "Aran, we're with you!" they called emotionally. But not, the doctor told himself, to love or to die together. And that's the only way. As it so happens, what has yet to be recorded before coming to the culmination, during the period when the plague was gathering all its forces to fling them at the town and lay its waste, is the long, heart-endingly monotonous struggle put up by some obstinate people like Rambert to recover their lost happiness and to balk the plague of that part of themselves, which they were ready to defend in the last ditch. This was their way of resisting the bondage closing in upon them, and while their resistance lacked the active virtues of the other, it had, to the narrator's thinking, its point, and moreover, it bore witness, even lit its futility and incoherences, to a salutary pride. Rambert fought to prevent the plague from besting him. Once assured that there was no way of getting out of the town by lawful methods, he decided, as he told Ryu, to have recourse to others. He began by sounding cafe waiters. A waiter usually knows much of what's going on behind the scenes, but the first he spoke to knew only of the very heavy penalties imposed on such attempts at evasion. In one of the cafes he visited, he was actually taken for a stool pigeon and curtly sent about his business. It was not until he happened to meet Kotad at Ryu's place that he made a little headway. On that day, he and Ryu had been talking again about his unsuccessful efforts to interest the authorities in his case, and Kotad heard the tail end of the conversation. Some days later, Kotad met him in the street and greeted him with the hail-fellow well-met manner that he now used on all occasions. "Hello, Rambert. Still no luck?" "None whatever. It's no good counting on the red-tape merchants. They couldn't understand it if they tried. I know that, and I'm trying to find some other way. But it's damn difficult." "Yes," Kotad replied. "It certainly is." He, however, knew a way to go about it, and he explained to Rambert, who was much surprised to learn this, that for some time past he had been going to the rounds of the cafes, had made a number of acquaintances, and had learned of the existence of an organization handling this sort of business. The truth was that Kotad, who had been beginning to live above his means, was now involved in smuggling ventures concerned with ration goods. Selling contraband cigarettes and inferior liquor at steadily rising prices, he was on the way to building up a small fortune. "Are you quite sure of this?" Rambert asked. "Quite. I had a proposal of this sort made to me the other day." "But you didn't accept it." "Oh, come, there's no need to be suspicious." Kotad's tone was genial. "I didn't accept it because, personally, I've no wish to leave. I have my reasons." After a short silence, he added, "You don't ask me what my reasons are, I notice." "I take it," Rambert replied, "that they're none of my business." "That's so, in a way, of course. But from another angle, well, let's put it like this. I've been feeling much more at ease here since plague settled in." Rambert made no comment. Then he asked, "And how does one approach this organization, as you call it?" "Ah, that's none too easy. Come with me." It was 4 in the afternoon. The town was warming up to a boiling point under the sultry sky. Nobody was about. All shops were shuttered. Kotad and Rambert walked some distance without speaking, under the arcades. This was an hour of the day when the plague lay low, so to speak. The silence, the extinction of all color and movement, might have been due as much to the fierce sunlight as to the epidemic, and there was no telling if the air was heavy with menace or merely with dust and heat. You had to look closely and take thoughts to realize that plague was here, for it betrayed its presence only by negative signs. Thus Kotad, who had affinities with it, drew Rambert's attention to the absence of the dogs that in normal times would have been sprawling in the shadow of the doorways, panting, trying to find a non-existent patch of coolness. They went along the Boulevard des Palmers, crossed the Place d'Armes, and then turned toward the docks. On the left was a cafe painted green, with a wide awning of coarse yellow canvas projecting over the sidewalk. Kotad and Rambert wiped their brows on entering. There were some small iron tables, also painted green, and folding chairs. The room was empty, the air humming with flies. In a yellow cage on the bar, a parrot squatted on its perch, all its feathers drooping. Some old pictures of military screens, covered with grime and cobwebs, adorned the walls. On the tables, including that at which Rambert was sitting, bird droppings were drying, and he was puzzled whence they came until, after some wing flappings, a handsome rooster came hopping out of its retreat in a dark corner. Just then the heat seemed to rise several degrees more. Courtauld took off his coat and banged on the tabletop. A very small man wearing a long blue apron that came nearly to his neck emerged from a doorway at the back, shouted a greeting to Courtauld, and, vigorously kicking the rooster out of his way, came up to the table. Raising his voice to drown the rooster's indignant cacklings, he asked what the gentleman would like. Courtauld ordered white wine and asked, "Where's Garcia?" The dwarf replied that she had not shown up at the cafe for several days.
"Think he'll come this evening?" "Well, I ain't any secrets, but you know when he usually comes, don't you?" "Yes, really it's nothing very urgent. I only want him to know this friend of mine."
The barkeeper rubbed his moist hands on the front of his apron.
"Ah, so this gentleman's in business too?"
"Yes," Courtauld said. The little man made a snuffling noise.
"All right, come back this evening. I'll send the kid to warn him."
After they had left, Rambert asked what the business in question might be.
"Why, smuggling, of course. They get the stuff in past the sentries at the gates. There's plenty of money in it."
"I see." Rambert paused for a moment, then asked,
"As I take it, they friends in court?"
"You said it." In the evening, the awning was rolled up, the parrot squawking in its cage, and the small tables were surrounded by men in their shirt sleeves. When Courtauld entered, one man, with a white shirt gaping on a brick-red chest and a straw hat, planted well back on his head, rose to his feet. He had a sun-tan-faced, regular features, small black eyes, very white teeth, and 2 or 3 rings on his fingers. He looked about 30.
"Aye,"
he said to Courtauld, ignoring Rambert.
"Let's have one at the bar."
They drank 3 rounds in silence.
"How about the stroll?"
Garcia suggested. They walked toward the harbor. Garcia asked what he wanted to do. Courtauld explained that it wasn't really for a deal that he wanted to introduce his friend, M. Rambert, but only for what he called a getaway. Puffing at his cigarette, Garcia walked straight ahead. He asked some questions, always referring to Rambert as he, and appearing not to notice his presence.
"Where does he want to go?" "His wife is in France."
"Ah." After a short pause, he added,
"What's his job?" "He's a journalist."
"Is he now? Journalists have long tongues."
"I told you he's a friend of mine,"
Courtauld replied. They walked on in silence until they were near the wharves, which were now railed off. Then they turned in the direction of a small tavern, from which came a smell of fried sardines.
"In any case,"
Garcia said finally,
"it's not up me alley. Raoul's your man, and I'll have to get in touch with him. It's none too easy." "That's so."
Courtauld sounded interesting.
"He's lying low, is he?"
Garcia made no answer. At the door of the tavern he halted, and for the first time addressed Rambert directly.
"The day after tomorrow, at 11, at the corner of the customs barracks in the upper town."
He made as if to go, then seemed to have an afterthought.
"It's going to cost something, you know."
He made the observation in a quite casual tone. Rambert nodded.
"Naturally."
On the way back, the journalist thanked Courtauld.
"Don't mention it, old chap. I'm only too glad to help you. And then you're a journalist. I dare say you'll put in a word for me one day or another."
2 days later, Rambert and Courtauld climbed the wide, shadeless street leading to the upper part of the town. The barracks occupied by the customs officers had been partly transformed into a hospital, and a number of people were standing outside the main entrance, some of them hoping to be allowed to visit a patient, a futile hope, since such visits were strictly prohibited, and others to glean some news of an invalid, news that in the course of an hour would have ceased to count. For these reasons, there was always a number of people and a certain amount of movement at this spot, a fact that probably accounted for its choice by Garcia for his meeting with Rambert.
"It puzzles me," Courtauld remarked, "why you're so keen on going. Really, what's happening here is extremely interesting." Not to me, Rambert replied. Well, yes, one's running some risks, I grant you. All the same, when you come to think of it, one ran quite as much risk in the old days crossing a busy street.
Just then, Ryu's car drew up level with them. Taro was at the wheel, and Ryu seemed half asleep. He aroused himself to make the introductions.
We know each other, Taro said. We're at the same hotel.
He then offered to drive Rambert back to the center.
No thanks. We have an appointment here.
Ryu looked hard at Rambert.
Yes?
Rambert said.
What's that?
Kotad seemed surprised.
The doctor knows about it.
There's the magistrate. Taro gave Kotad a warning glance. Kotad's look changed. Othen was striding down the street toward them, briskly, yet with dignity. He took off his hat as he came up with them.
Good morning, Monsieur Othen, said Taro.
The magistrate returned the greeting of the men in the car, and, turning to Rambert and Kotad, who were in the background, gave them a quiet nod. Taro introduced Kotad and the journalist. The magistrate gazed at the sky for a moment, sighed, and remarked that these were indeed sad times.
I've been told, Monsieur Taro, he continued, that you are helping to enforce the prophylactic measures. I need hardly to say how commendable that is. A fine example. Do you think, Dr. Ryu, that the epidemic will get worse?
Ryu replied that one could only hope it wouldn't, and the magistrate replied that one must never lose hope. The ways of Providence were inscrutable. Taro asked if his work had increased as the result of present conditions.
Quite the contrary. Criminal cases of what we call the first instance are growing rarer. In fact, almost my only work just now is holding inquiries into more serious breaches of the new regulations. Our ordinary laws have never been so well respected.
That's because, by contrast, they necessarily appear good ones, Taro observed. The magistrate, who seemed unable to take his gaze off the sky, abruptly dropped his mildly meditative air and stared at Taro.
What does that matter? It's not the law that counts, it's the sentence, and that is something we must all accept.
That fellow, said Taro when the magistrate was out of hearing, is enemy number one. He pressed the starter. Some minutes later, Rambert and Kotad saw Garcia approaching. Without making any sign of recognition, he came straight up to them and, by way of greeting, said,
You'll have to wait a bit.
There was complete silence in the crowd around them, most of whom were women. Nearly all were carrying parcels. They had the vain hope of somehow smuggling those in to their sick relatives, and the even crazier idea that the latter could eat the food they've brought. The gate was guarded by armed sentries, and now and then an eerie cry resounded in the courtyard between the barrack rooms and the entrance. Whenever this happened, anxious eyes turned toward the sick wards. The three men were watching the scene when a brisk "good morning" from behind them made them swing around. In spite of the heat, Raoul was wearing a well-cut dark suit and a felt hat with rolled-up brim. He was tall and strongly built, his face rather pale. Hardly moving his lips, he said quickly and clearly,
Let's walk down to the center. You, Garcia, needn't come.
Garcia lit a cigarette and remained there whilst they walked away. Placing himself between Rambert and Kotad, Raoul set the pace, a fast one.
Garcia explained the situation, he said. We can fix it, but I must warn you, it'll cost you a cool 10,000.
Rambert said he agreed to these terms.
Lunch with me tomorrow at the Spanish restaurant near the docks.
Rambert said,
Right.
And Raoul shook his hand, smiling for the first time. After he had gone, Kotad said he wouldn't be able to come to lunch next day, as he had an engagement. But anyhow, Rambert didn't need him anymore. When next day Rambert entered the Spanish restaurant, everyone turned and stared at him. The dark, cellar-like room, below the level of the small yellow street, was patronized only by men, mostly Spaniards, judging by their looks. Raoul was sitting at a table at the back of the room. Once he had beckoned to the journalist, and Rambert started to go toward him, the curiosity left the faces of others, and they bent over their plates again. Raoul had beside him a tall, thin, ill-shaven man with enormously wide shoulders, an equine face, and thinning hair. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, displaying long, skinny arms covered with black hair. When Rambert was introduced, he gave 3 slow nods. His own name, however, was not announced, and Raoul, when referring to him, always said, "Our friend." "Our friend here thinks he may be able to help you. He is going." Raoul broke off, as the waitress had just come to take Rambert's order. "He is going to put you in touch with 2 of our friends who will introduce you to some sentries whom we've squared. But that doesn't mean you can start right away. You'll have to leave it to the sentries to decide on the best moment. The simplest thing will be for you to stay some nights with one of them. His home is quite near the gate. The first thing is for our friend here to give you the contacts needed. Then when everything's set, you'll settle with him for the expenses." Again, the friend slowly moved his equine head up and down, without ceasing to munch the tomato and pimento salad he was shoveling into his mouth. After he began to speak, with a slight Spanish accent, he asked Rambert to meet him, the next day but one, at 8 in the morning, in the cathedral porch. "Another 2 days' wait," Rambert observed. "It ain't so easy as all that, you see," Raoul said. "Them boys take some finding." Horseface nodded slow approval once more. Some time was spent looking for a subject of conversation. The problem was solved easily enough when Rambert discovered that Horseface was an ardent football player. He, too, had been very keen on soccer. They discussed the French championship, the merits of professional English teams, and the technique of passing. By the end of the meal, Horseface was in high good humor, when calling Rambert old boy, and trying to convince him that the most sporting position by far on the football field was that of center half. "You see, old boy, it's the center half that does the placing. And that's the whole art of the game, isn't it?" Rambert was inclined to agree, though he personally had always played center forward. The discussion proceeded peacefully until a radio was turned on, and, after at first emitting a series of sentimental songs, broke into the announcement that there had been 137 plague deaths on the previous day. No one present betrayed the least emotion. Horseface merely shrugged and stood up. As they were going out, the center half shook Rambert's hand vigorously. "My name's Gonzales," he said. To Rambert, the next 2 days seemed endless. He looked up Ryu and described to him the latest developments, then accompanied the doctor on one of his calls. He took leave of him on the doorstep of a house where a patient, suspected to have plague, was awaiting him. There was a sound of footsteps and voices in the hall. The families were being warned of the doctor's visit. "I hope Thoreau will be on time," Ryu murmured. He looked worn out. "Is the epidemic getting out of hand?" Rambert asked. Ryu said it wasn't that. Indeed, the death graph was rising less steeply. Only, they lacked adequate means of coping with the disease. "We're short of equipment. In all the armies of the world, a shortage of equipment is usually compensated for by manpower. But we're short on manpower, too." "Haven't doctors and trained assistants been sent from other towns?" "Yes," Ryu said. 10 doctors and 100 helpers. That sounds a lot, no doubt, but it's barely enough to cope with the present state of affairs. And it will be quite inadequate if things get worse." Rambert, who had been listening to the sounds within the house, turned to Ryu with a friendly smile. "Yes," he said. "You'd better make haste to win your battle." Then a shadow crossed his face. "You know," he added in a low voice, "it's not because of that I'm leaving." Ryu replied that he knew it very well, but Rambert went on to say, "I don't think I'm a coward, not as a rule, anyhow, and I've opportunities of putting it to the test. Only there are some thoughts I simply cannot endure." The doctor looked him in the eyes. "You'll see her again," he said. "Maybe. But I just can't stomach the thought that it may last on, and all the time she'll be growing older. At 30, one's beginning to age, and one's got to squeeze all one can out of life. But I doubt if you can understand." Ryu was replying that he thought he could, when Thoreau came up, obviously much excited. "I've just asked Peneleo to join us." "Well?" asked the doctor. "He thought it over, and then said yes." "That's good," the doctor said. "I'm glad to know he's better than his sermon." "Most people are like that," Thoreau replied. "It's only a matter of giving them the chance." He smiled and winked at Ryu. That's my job in life, giving people chances. Excuse me, Rambert said. I've got to be off. On Thursday, the day of the appointment, Rambert entered the cathedral porch at 5 minutes to 8. The air was still relatively cool. Small fleecy clouds, which presently the sun would swallow at a gulp, were drifting across the sky. A faint smell of moisture rose from the lawns, parched though they were. Still masked by the eastward houses, the sun was warming up Joan of Arc's helmet only, and it made a solitary patch of brightness in the cathedral square. A clock struck 8. Rambert took some steps in the empty porch. From inside came a low sound of intoning voices, together with stale wafts of incense and dank air. Then the voices ceased. 10 small black forms came out of the building and hastened away toward the center of the town. Rambert grew impatient. Other black forms climbed the steps and entered the porch. He was about to light a cigarette when it struck him that smoking might be frowned on here. At 8:15, the organ began to play, very softly. Rambert entered. At first he could see nothing in the dim light of the aisle. After a moment, he made out in the nave the small black forms that had preceded him. They were all grouped in a corner, in front of a makeshift altar, on which they stood a statue of Saint Roch, carved in haste by one of our local sculptors. Kneeling, they looked even smaller than before, blobs of clotted darkness hardly more opaque than the gray, smoky haze in which they seemed to float. Above them, the organ was playing endless variations. When Rambert stepped out of the cathedral, he saw Gonzalez already going down the steps on his way back to the town. "I thought you'd cleared off, old boy," he said to the journalist. "Considering how late it is." He proceeded to explain that he'd gone to meet his friends at the place agreed on, which was quite nearby, at 10 to 8, the time they'd fixed, and waited 20 minutes without seeing them. "Something must have held them up. There's lots of snags, you know, in our line of business." He suggested another meeting at the same time on the following day, beside the war memorial. Rambert sighed and pushed his hat back on his head. "Don't take it so hard," Gonzalez laughed. "Why, think of all the swerves and runs and passes you've got to make to score a goal." "Quite so," Rambert agreed. "But the game only lasts an hour and a half." The war memorial at Oran stands at the one place where one has a glimpse of the sea, a sort of esplanade following for a short distance the brow of the cliff overlooking the harbor. Next day, being again the first to arrive at the meeting place, Rambert whiled away the time reading the lists of names who had died for their country. Some minutes later, 2 men strolled up, gave him a casual glance, then, resting their elbows on the parapet of the esplanade, gazed down intently at the empty, lifeless harbor. Both wore short-sleeved jerseys and blue trousers, and were of much the same height. The journalist moved away, and, seated on a stone bench, studied their appearance at leisure. They were obviously youngsters, not more than 20. Just then, he saw Gonzalez coming up. "Those are our friends," he said, after apologizing for being late. Then he led Rambert to the 2 youths, whom he introduced as Marcel and Louis. They looked so much alike that Rambert had no doubt they were brothers. "Right," said Gonzalez. "Now you know each other, you can get down to business." Marseille, or Louis, said that their turn of guard duty began in 2 days, and lasted a week. They'd have to watch out for the night when there was the best chance of bringing it off. The trouble was that there were 2 other sentries, regular soldiers, besides themselves, at the west gate. These 2 men had better to be kept out of the business. One couldn't depend on them, and anyhow it would pile up expenses unnecessarily. Some evenings, however, these 2 sentries spent several hours in the back room of a nearby bar. Marseille, or Louis, said that the best thing Rambert could do would be to stay at their place, which was only a few minutes' walk from the gate, and wait till one of them came to tell him the coast was clear. It should then be quite easy for him to make his getaway. But there was no time to lose. There had been talk about setting up duplicate sentry posts a little farther out. Rambert agreed, and handed some of his few remaining cigarettes to the young men. The one who had not spoken yet asked Gonzalez if the question of expenses had been settled on, and whether an advance would be given. "No," Gonzalez said.
And you needn't bother about that. He's a pal of mine. He'll pay when he leaves.
Another meeting was arranged. Gonzalez suggested their dining together on the next day but one, at the Spanish restaurant. It was at easy walking distance from where the young men lived.
For the first night, he added, I'll keep you company, old boy.
The next day, on his way to the bedroom, Rambert met Tarot coming down the stairs at the hotel.
Not to come with me?
He asked.
I'm just off to see Ryu.
Rambert hesitated.
Well, I never feel sure I'm not disturbing him.
I don't think you need to worry about that. He's talked about you quite a lot. The journalist pondered. Then,
Look here, he said. If you've any time to spare after dinner, never mind how late, why not come to the hotel, both of you, and have a drink with me?
That will depend on Ryu.
Tarot sounded doubtful. And on the plague, said Tarot.
At 11 o'clock that night, however, Ryu and Tarot entered the small, narrow bar of the hotel. Some 30 people were crowded into it, all talking at the top of their voices. Coming from the silence of the plague-bound town, the two newcomers were startled by the sudden burst of noise, and halted in the doorway. They understood the reason for it when they saw that liquor was still to be had here. Rambert, who was perched on a stool at the corner of the bar, beckoned to them. With complete coolness, he elbowed away a noisy customer behind him to make room for his friends.
You've no objection to a spot of something strong?
No, Tarot replied. Quite the contrary. Ryu sniffed the pungency of bitter herbs in the drink that Rambert handed him. It was hard to make oneself heard in the din of voices, but Rambert seemed chiefly concerned with drinking. The doctor couldn't make up his mind whether he was drunk yet. At one of the two tables that occupied all the remaining space beyond the half-circle round the bar, a naval officer, with a girl on each side of him, was describing to a fat, red-faced man a typhus epidemic at Cairo.
They had camps, you know, he was saying, for the natives, with tents for the sick ones and a ring of sentries all round. If a member of the family came along and tried to smuggle in one of those damn fool native remedies, they fired at sight. A bit tough, I grant you, but it was the only thing to do.
At the other table, round which sat a bevy of bright young people, the talk was incomprehensible, half drowned by the stridence of St. James Infirmary coming from a loudspeaker just above their heads.
Any luck?
Rambert had to raise his voice.
I'm getting on, Rambert replied. In the course of the week, perhaps.
A pity, Tarot shouted.
Why?
Tarot said that he thinks you might be useful to us here, but personally, I understand your wish to get away only too well. Tarot stood the next round of drinks. Rambert got off his stool and looked him in the eyes for the first time.
How could I be useful?
Why, of course, Tarot replied, slowly reaching toward his glass.
In one of our sanitary squads.
The look of brooding obstinacy that Rambert so often had come back to his face, and he climbed again onto his stool.
Don't you think these squads of ours do any good?
Asked Tarot, who had just taken a sip of his glass and was gazing hard at Rambert.
I'm sure they do,
the journalist replied, and drank off his glass. Ryu noticed that his hand was shaking, and he decided, definitely, that the man was far gone in drink. Next day, when for the second time Rambert entered the Spanish restaurant, he had to make his way through a group of men who had taken chairs out on the sidewalk and were sitting in the green-gold evening light, enjoying the first breaths of cooler air. They were smoking an acrid-smelling tobacco. The restaurant itself was almost empty. Rambert went to the table at the back, at which Gonzalez had sat when they met for the first time. He told the waitress he could wait a bit. It was 7:30. In twos and threes, the men from outside began to dribble in and seat themselves at the tables. The waitresses began serving them, and a tinkle of knives and forks, a hum of conversation, began to fill the cellar-like room. At 8, Rambert was still waiting. The lights were turned on. A new set of people took the other chairs at his table. He ordered dinner. At 8:30, he had finished without having seen either Gonzalez or the two young men. He smoked several cigarettes. The restaurant was gradually emptying. Outside, night was falling rapidly. The curtains hung across the doorway were billowing in a warm breeze from the sea. At 9, Rambert realized that the restaurant was quite empty and the waitress was eyeing him curiously. He paid, went out, and, noticing that a cafe across the street was open, settled down there at a place from which he could keep an eye on the entrance of the restaurant. At 9:30, he walked slowly back to his hotel, racking his brains for some method of tracking down Gonzalez, whose address he did not know, and bitterly discouraged by the not unlikely prospect of having to start the tiresome business all over again. It was at this moment, as he walked in the dark streets along which ambulances were speeding, that it suddenly struck him, as he informed Dr. Ryu subsequently, that all this time he'd practically forgotten the woman he loved. So absorbed had he been in trying to find a rift in the walls that cut him off from her. But at this same moment, now that once more all means of escape were sealed against him, he felt his longing for her blaze up again, with a violence so sudden, so intense, that he started running to his hotel, as if to escape the burning pain that nonetheless pervaded him, racing like wildfire in his blood. Very early next day, however, he called on Ryu to ask him where he could find Quotard. "The only thing to do is pick up the thread again where I dropped it. Come tomorrow night," Ryu said. "Taro asked me to invite Quotard here. I don't know why. He's due to come at 10. Come at 10:30. When Quotard visited the doctor next day, Taro and Ryu were discussing the case of one of Ryu's patients, who against all expectation, had recovered. "It was 10-1 against," Taro commented. "He was in luck."
"Oh, come on now," Quotard said. "It can't have been plague."
They assured him there was no doubt it was a case of plague.
"That's impossible, since he recovered. You know as well as I do, once you have plague, your number's up."
"True enough, as a general rule," Ryu replied. "But if you refuse to be beaten, you have some pleasant surprises."
Quotard laughed. "Brasses few, anyhow. You saw the number of deaths this evening?"
Taro, who was gazing amiably at Quotard, said he knew the latest figures, and that the position was extremely serious. But what did it prove? Only that still more stringent measures should be applied.
"How? You can't make more stringent ones than those we have now."
"No, but every person in the town must apply them to himself." Quotard stared at him in a puzzled manner, and Taro went on to say that there were far too many slackers, that this plague was everybody's business, and everybody should do his duty. For instance, any able-bodied man was welcome in the sanitary squads.
"That's an idea," said Quotard, "but it won't get you anywhere. The plague has the wisp hand of you, and there's nothing to be done about it."
"We shall know whether that is so." Taro's voice was carefully controlled. "Only when we've tried everything." Meanwhile, Ryu had been sitting at his desk, copying out reports. Taro was still gazing at the little businessman, who was stirring uneasily in his chair.
"Look here, Monsieur Quotard, why don't you join us?"
Picking up his derby hat, Quotard rose from his chair with an offended expression.
"It's not my job," he said.
Then, with an air of bravado, he added,
"What's more, the plague suits me quite well, and I see no reason why I should bother about trying to stop it."
As if a new idea had just waylaid him, Taro struck his forehead.
"Why, of course, I was forgetting. If it wasn't for that, you'd be arrested."
Quotard gave a start and gripped the back of the chair as if he were about to fall. Ryu had stopped writing and was observing him with grave interest.
"Who told you that?"
Quotard almost screamed.
"Why, you yourself."
Taro looked surprised.
"At least that's what the doctor and I have gathered from the way you speak."
Losing all control of himself, Quotard let out a volley of oaths. "Don't get excited," Taro said quietly. "Neither I nor the doctor would dream of reporting you to the police. What you may have done is no business of ours. And anyway, we've never had much use for the police.
Well, come now, sit down again."
Quotard looked at the chair, then hesitantly lowered himself into it. He heaved a deep sigh.
"It's something that happened ages ago," he began. "Somehow they've dug it up. I thought it all had been forgotten. But somebody's still talking, damn him. They sent for me and told me not to budge till the inquiry was finished. And I felt pretty sure they'd end up by arresting me."
"Was it anything serious?" Taro asked.
"That depends on what you mean by serious. It wasn't murder, anyhow."
"Prison or transportation with hard labor?" Quotard was looking almost abject.
Well, prison if I'm lucky.
But after a moment, he grew excited again.
It was all a mistake. Everybody makes mistakes, and I can't bear the idea of being pulled in for that. Of being torn from my home and habits and everyone I know.
And that is the reason, Tarot asked, why you had the bright idea of hanging yourself.
Yes, and it was a damn fool thing to do, I admit.
For the first time, Ryu spoke. He told Kotard that he quite understood his anxiety, but perhaps everything would come right in the end.
Oh, for the moment, I've nothing to fear.
I can see, Tarot said, that you are not going to join in our effort. Twiddling his hat uneasily, Kotard gazed at Tarot with shifty eyes.
I hope you won't bear me a grudge.
Certainly not, but, Tarot smiled, do try at least not to propagate the microbe deliberately. Kotard protested that he'd never wanted the plague. It was pure chance that it had broken out, and he wasn't to blame if it happened to make things easier for him just now. Then he seemed to pluck up courage again, and when Rambert entered, was shouting almost aggressively.
What's more, I'm pretty sure you won't get anywhere.
Rambert learned to his chagrin that Kotard didn't know where Gonzalez lived. He suggested that they better pay another visit to a small cafe. They made an appointment for the following day, when Ryu gave him to understand that he'd like to be kept posted. Rambert proposed that he and Tarot should look him up one night at the end of the week. They could come as late as they liked, and would be sure to find him in his room. Next morning, Kotard and Rambert went to the cafe, and left a message for Garcia, asking him to come that evening, or if this could not be managed, next day. They waited in vain for him that evening. Next day, Garcia turned up. He listened in silence to what Rambert had to say, then informed him he had no idea what had happened, but he knew that several districts of the town had been isolated for 24 hours for a house-to-house inspection. Quite possibly, Gonzalez and the two youngsters hadn't been able to get through the cordon. All he could do was to put them in touch once more with Raoul. Naturally, this couldn't be done before the next day, but one.
I see, Rambert said. I'll have to start it all over again, from scratch.
On the next day but one, Raoul, who Rambert met at a street corner, confirmed Garcia's surmise. The low-lying districts had, in fact, been isolated, and a cordon put around them. The next thing was to get in contact with Gonzalez. 2 days later, Rambert was lunching with the footballer.
It's too damn easy, Gonzalez said. Of course you should have managed some way of seeing each other.
Rambert heartily agreed.
Tomorrow morning, Gonzalez continued, we'll lock up the kids and try to get a real move on.
When they called next day, however, the youngsters were out. A note was left fixing a meeting for the following day at noon, outside the high school. When Rambert came back to his hotel, Tarot was struck by the look on his face.
Not feeling well? He asked. It's having to start it all over again that's got me down.
Then he added,
You'll come tonight, won't you?
When the two friends entered Rambert's room that night, they found him lying on the bed. He got up at once and filled the glasses he had ready, before lifting his to his lips. Ryu asked him if he was making progress. The journalist replied that he'd started the same round again and got to the same point as before. In a day or two, he was to have his last appointment. Then he took a sip of his drink and added, gloomily,
Needless to say, they won't turn up. How come? That doesn't follow because they let you down last time. So you haven't understood yet?
Rambert shrugged his shoulders almost scornfully.
Understood what? The plague.
Ah, Ryu exclaimed.
No, you haven't understood that it means exactly that. The same thing over and over and over again.
He went to a corner of the room and started a small phonograph.
What's that record? Tarot asked. I've heard it before. It's St. James Infirmary.
While the phonograph was playing, 2 shots rang out in the distance.
A dog or a getaway, Tarot remarked.
When a moment later, the record ended, an ambulance bell could be heard clanging past under the window and receding into silence.
Rather boring record, Rambert remarked. And this must be the 10th time I've put it on today.
Are you really so fond of it? No, but it's the only one I have.
And after a moment, he added,
That's what I said it was. The same thing, over and over again.
He asked Ryu how the sanitary groups were functioning. 5 teams were now at work, and it was hoped to form others. Sitting on the bed, the journalist seemed to be studying his fingernails. Ryu was gazing at his squat, powerfully built form, hunched up on the edge of the bed. Suddenly he realized that Rambert was returning his gaze.
You know, Doctor, I've given a lot of thought to your campaign, and if I'm not with you, I have my reasons. No, I don't think that it's afraid to risk my skin again. I took part in the Spanish Civil War. On which side? Tarot asked. The losing side. But since then, I've done a bit of thinking. About what? Courage. I now know that man is capable of great deeds. But if he isn't capable of a great emotion, well, he leaves me cold. One has the idea that he is capable of everything, Tarot remarked. I can't agree. He is incapable of suffering for a long time, or being happy for a long time, which means that he's incapable of anything really worthwhile.
He looked at the 2 men in turn, then added,
Tell me, Tarot, are you capable of dying for love? I couldn't say, but I hardly think so, as I am now. You see, but you're capable of dying for an idea. One can see that right away. Well, personally, I've seen enough of people who die for an idea. I don't believe in heroism. I know it's easy and I've learned it can be murderous. What interests me is living and dying for what one loves.
Ryu had been watching the journalist attentively. With his eyes still on him, he said quietly,
Man isn't an idea, Rambert.
Rambert sprang off the bed, his face ablaze with passion.
Man is an idea, and a precious small idea once he turns his back on love. And that's my point. We, mankind, have lost the capacity for love. We must face that fact, Doctor. Let's wait to acquire that capacity, or if it's really beyond us, wait for the deliverance that will come to each of us anyway, without his playing the hero. Personally, I look no farther.
Ryu rose. He suddenly appeared very tired.
You're right, Rambert. Quite right. And for nothing in the world would I try to dissuade you from what you're trying to do. It seems to me absolutely right and proper. However, there's one thing I must tell you. There's no question of heroism in all this. It's a matter of common decency. That's an idea which may make some people smile, but the only means of righting a plague is common decency. What do you mean by common decency? Rambert's tone was grave. I don't know what it means for other people, but in my case, I know that it consists in doing my job. Your job! I only wish I was sure what my job is.
There was a mordant edge to Rambert's voice.
Maybe I'm all wrong in putting love first.
Ryu looked him in the eyes.
No, he said vehemently, you are not wrong.
Rambert gazed thoughtfully at them.
You two, he said. I suppose you've nothing to lose in all this. It's easier, that way, to be on the side of the angels.
Ryu drained his glass.
Come along, he said to Tarot. We've work to do.
He went out. Tarot followed, but seemed to change his mind when he reached the door. He stopped and looked at the journalist.
I suppose you don't know that Ryu's wife is in a sanatorium, 100 miles or so away.
Rambert showed surprise, and began to say something, but Tarot had already left the room. At a very early hour next day, Rambert rang up the doctor.
Would you agree to my working with you until I find some way of getting out of the town?
There was a moment's silence before the reply came.
Certainly, Rambert. Thanks.